Okay, this is going to be one of those videos that I'm going to start with a picture. And the picture is right here. This is a picture of a mouse lying down. Except that in the right picture, this mouse is no longer alive. In other words, this picture shows us a mouse that passed away and now appears to be kind of different. But what exactly are we seeing here? Well, this is really what this video is about. This bizarre phenomenon is known as UPE, ultra-weak photon emissions, a previously hypothetical phenomenon that was actually believed to exist based on what we know about biochemistry inside a typical body. But up until relatively recently, it was completely unproven and it was impossible to see it. Yet here in this recent study, researchers definitively showed us that UPE seems to be real, and living bodies, and actually anything living, seems to produce a kind of a biological light, or I guess biophotons, representing an extremely weak type of luminescence that's different from any kind of other bioluminescence produced by certain bacteria. And so in this video we're going to discuss the study you can find in a description by Salari and the team you see right here, with the title Imaging UPE from Living and Dead Mice and from Plants Under Stress. In essence, definitively showing us that UPE seems to be a real phenomenon, or showing us that most life on Earth seems to emit a certain type of light that basically disappears when that something dies. But here let's start with something super important, just because all of this can be easily misinterpreted pretty quickly. Here we're not talking about anything paranormal or some kind of an aura claimed to exist by various psychics, because that is not at all what we're discussing or what's being investigated. These are actual biological and electromagnetic emissions coming from within various cells and produced by very specific chemical reactions. And as a matter of fact, this glow is much weaker than what we typically detect with an infrared camera. In this case, this is also a biological electromagnetic emission, but it's based entirely on our heat, or basically the emissions in the infrared produced by humans and pretty much all other warm-blooded animals. For example, here's a picture of some kind of an animal. Take a guess what this is. And so instead here we're talking about something that seems to be emitted in optical light, so basically something that's technically visible to our eyes, but something that's super weak, or basically light that's so dim that it would be impossible to see without some kind of a specialized camera. But first, I guess let's discuss the main theory behind this and how all of this works, and then discuss what was discovered. Now, first of all, this is obviously not the first study about this and not the first attempt to try to see this. There are quite a lot of different studies out there that try to create similar effects by doing something slightly different. For example, in this study, researchers tried to create a very similar response by causing stress on the skin through the illumination with the ultraviolet radiation. Or basically here, by exposing skin to the UV light, researchers hypothesized that we're going to be seeing more ultra-weak photon emissions. But the science behind this has been explored for many decades. This was previously referred to as biophotons, and technically it was kind of controversial before, but the idea was pretty sound. And here the assumption was that typical biological processes should be able to create some kind of light, or essentially form of chemiluminescence, kind of similar to what we see from, for example, fireflies, but obviously much dimmer. Or just to rephrase this, the same chemical response that makes fireflies glow technically happens in many different cells, but just to a much smaller extent. Although, just to correct myself right away, in case of fireflies, they actually do produce something referred to as luciferase. You can learn about this in one of the previous videos in the description. But the overall principle is not so different in a sense that it basically relies on oxygen and certain proteins, which results in an oxidation reaction that then produces light. And so a typical firefly controls the brightness of the light by controlling the amount of oxygen. And so even as far back as 1980s, several scientific teams claim to have detected various types of light coming from various types of tissues, and here we're talking about light detectable with our eyes, with initial explanations basically suggesting that this was a reactive oxygen species that seems to cause protein oxidation that then triggers electron excitation and the creation of light. But in most cases, a lot of this light was very dim, and so technically it could have been coming from something else entirely, and so for many years this sort of remained more or less unproven. But the explanation behind this, and of course why this was important, encouraged a lot of teams to pursue this further and to try to prove this once and for all. And here the reasons were obvious. A lot of these oxidizing agents were normally the result of stress. In other words, when the body is stressed, or technically when the cell is stressed, such as for example when exposed to ultraviolet radiation, various reactive oxygen species are normally produced inside the cell and start to interact with a lot of different proteins. And so technically any stressor, like for example even a poison, can produce these oxygen species, which then causes the transformation inside the cells, causing certain proteins to kick off certain electrons, which basically releases light. And in theory, this would basically allow us to physically see stressed organisms, which would be super important in any medical field. You could use this to physically see what body part or what cell is potentially causing the distress. Here, the stressed body part or the stressed organ would physically light up and become easily visible. And so this remote monitoring of stress has a lot of potential application: medicine, animal husbandry, or even agriculture, because this also applies to plants. But up until recently, once again, this was kind of hypothetical. And so here we have this new research coming out of Canada. A team from University of Calgary decided to test this once again by using what's known as EMCCD, an image sensor capable of detecting and quantifying a single photon event, making it possible to observe any light, no matter how dim it is. So basically here we're talking about a super sensitive camera, with the experiment itself involving mice, living and then dead. Now, not all of you might find this ethical, but this is basically done in most labs, especially medical labs, so this is just something that's generally accepted in the scientific field. But in a nutshell, they took 4 mice, they injected them with anesthesia, and placed them on a heating mat. This was done in order to prevent their bodies from cooling down and in order to maintain relatively constant temperature. The mice were then euthanized, with the researchers observing how the light from mice changed over time. And it becomes pretty obvious that the light coming from these mice, actual optical light, not infrared light, dropped dramatically within approximately 1 hour. In this case, definitively showing researchers that individual cells inside mice were producing visible light until the cells became dead, and proving that there was a significant drop in these UPEs following the demise of mice. But in order to see if this is actually something that happens to living beings, or if this was some kind of an experimental fluke, they did this again with plants as well. And so here, by using leaves from several different trees, and by causing stress inside these leaves, in this case by applying certain chemical agents, they definitively showed that it was really the reactive oxygen species that were causing all of this light. And so basically here, by increasing stress in certain regions, they increased the amount of light. This is something that was visible for many hours afterwards. But after approximately 16 hours, the leaves returned to normal, indicating that they were no longer stressed, and the oxygen species were no longer being produced. And interestingly, it was the application of what's known as benzocaine, or a local anesthetic, which seemed to produce the highest amount of emissions. And which also confirms that this is definitely something we can use in diagnostic techniques, and something that can be used to observe if a plant or an animal are healthy. But obviously this was very, very low intensity. Here we're talking about just thousands of photons per centimeter square per second, or something that will be practically invisible to human eye. Nevertheless, this extraordinary experiment almost definitively confirms that these biophotons, or UPEs, seem to indeed exist, and basically all living beings and everything alive seems to produce just a little bit of light, but we just cannot see it. Although here I think it would be interesting to find out if there really is an animal out there that can actually see this somehow. I mean, for all we know, maybe cats can actually see the mice that way. Although here this is just pure speculation. But here some of the biologists that read this study also suggest trying something else just to see if this is really what's happening. For example, in one of the future experiments, it might be possible to see if blood flow in this case can still encourage the production of this light, because here the blood itself is still going to be carried around the body and will still deliver oxygen to various body parts. And so if this is indeed biophotons produced through oxygenation, by controlling for blood flow, it might be possible to prove this even further. Because alternatively, this could be produced by maybe something else. Maybe, for example, mitochondria, which do produce huge amounts of energy and are thus expected to produce something as well, or maybe by some other chemical reaction that was not previously considered. And so when it comes to explaining exactly what's happening, or exactly how this phenomenon works, there are still quite a lot of questions. None of this is still completely understood. For all we know, maybe this is a result of some kind of a signaling molecule, or some other response to stress that was not considered before, or maybe some other reaction due to metabolism that suddenly stops when something dies. Either way, just to highlight again, this time it's really only possible because of these super extremely accurate cameras that will be very difficult to detect otherwise. And that's because any living being emits a lot of other stuff as well. As a matter of fact, human body extremely likely produces a lot of other emissions. Obviously emissions in the infrared, but also possibly radio emissions, and maybe even emissions from various nuclear reactions going on in certain atoms inside our cells. And we'll actually come back and talk more about all of this in some of the future videos that are coming really soon. And so make sure to subscribe if you want to find out what. And so until then, or until future discoveries, that's pretty much all I wanted to mention. A really intriguing discovery and a really important confirmation that biophotons or ultra-weak photon emissions seem to be real, and a really important confirmation that living things seem to actually glow. Just a little bit. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and well, I'm actually currently in between studios, mostly because my old place got flooded, and so I have to record a few videos somewhere else. But because I also lost a bunch of footage and essentially lost my hard drives, I had to quickly come up with some additional videos, including this one, on various scientific topics that I personally find super interesting, but never got to explore. And well, in this video we're going to discuss something that I sort of came up with on the way here, as I was driving, and as I was looking at the wheels. As the title of the video suggests, we're going to discuss the wheel. Okay, I know, kind of cheesy and stuff, but bear with me. Because there is a really recent research that surprisingly discovers something we might have not known before. It potentially discovers a very unusual origin of the wheel as a concept, and it's absolutely not what anyone expected. And this is based on a lot of archaeological evidence and even scientific and engineering evidence, where scientists managed to provide a relatively accurate model, basically showing us where the wheel possibly came from. And so in this video we're going to discuss humanity's most fundamental invention. Possibly the most important invention in the early history that might sound kind of simple and kind of obvious today, really isn't. Especially because if you were to look at the history of humanity, the wheel as a concept is technically a relatively new invention. But for a very long time, well, really for centuries, historians and archaeologists pondered and argued on who actually invented the wheel and where did it really come from. And the answer turns out to be kind of fascinating, but also very unexpected. In essence, kind of also showing us how a lot of inventions came to be and how even early humanity learned to innovate in some really bizarre ways. With most of this based on a combination of computer simulations and analysis, and of course archaeological evidence from thousands of years ago. But here let's also start with some of the previous assumptions based on the evidence from various early cultures. So turns out it was not Egyptians, it was not Babylonians, and it was not any of the ancient cultures living in the Middle East that you'd think would be the ones inventing this crucial tool. I mean, we do have depictions of different wheels from ancient Sumerians, for example. This is from approximately 4,500 years ago, but there is no evidence that they were the first. We also know that wheels were invented independently in Mesoamerica or in the New World, but none of this had any practical use. And well, according to Wikipedia, this is the oldest wheel known to us. This is the Ljubljana Marshes wheel that seems to be about 5,100 years old. This would be in the modern-day Slovenia. And in this case, there is one relatively old research that scientists only started talking about again in relatively recent times. Now here you can find these studies in the description below, but in essence at least one of the studies seems to explore the idea of the wheel coming from the 4th millennium BC from Europe. This would be approximately 6,000 years ago, and it seems to have come as a result of early mining. Now here we actually have to first explore the idea behind how this probably started and why it kind of makes sense. And well, first let's ignore the wheel and let's start with the actual concept involved in this and how the early humans potentially thought about it. Now this is also based on some of the earliest evidence, but today archaeologists believe that most of this extremely likely started with simple rollers. Except that the problem with rollers is that you always have to carry them back to the front, and this was probably not a very effective way to transport things on any terrain that was not even. And so overall, rollers are just not very practical. But a lot of these new theories propose that it very likely started with a roller, but then as a result of friction and basically physics, something else started to happen. And here this is based on quite a lot of different evidence. More than 150 different wagons have been discovered in certain regions in Europe that all resembled something like this, but with different levels of complexity. In essence, showing a kind of an evolutionary process of how these wheels changed over time. And all this was from a culture most of us have probably never heard of before. They're referred to as Bowleres culture. Part of the Baden culture you see right here, marked in violet. And this was a culture living mostly in the Central and the Southern Europe, renowned for their extremely advanced pottery. And here we have the oldest evidence for actual wheeled objects, and specifically wagons, including ceramic wagons or wagon-shaped pottery, sometimes made with a handle. Although obviously why they are made this way, nobody knows. And though no actual wagons have been discovered, so far the presence of wheeled objects and the presence of the pottery depicting wagons suggests that they were most likely able to create them and to use them for something. But these were definitely not toys. Mostly because on their surface there was also a kind of an engraving resembling a typical basket very often used by miners in this exact era. And so here archaeologists suggest that there's a direct link between mining operations and these unusual wagons. In other words, there's a kind of an indirect evidence for the use of these first wheels in order to transport something that was being mined, with the basic depiction being something like this. But the question is, how did these early miners manage to create this without advanced scientific knowledge and moreover made them almost perfect? And well, here the suggestion is that this was probably kind of by accident, but also through the process of trial and error, and it probably all started with rollers. But in order to make these rollers more functional, the first modification had to be the cart itself. These carts had to have some kind of a socket in order to hold rollers in place so you wouldn't have to move them all the time. And this of course meant that you only had to use 2 rollers instead of using a bunch of them, making things a lot more efficient. And though this was probably the first start, eventually, completely by accident, or possibly intentionally, these rollers started to kind of advance and change their shape, becoming thinner and thinner. And at first, it might have been just the result of friction. As these rollers were spinning, the friction between the sockets and the roller started to make the axle just a little bit thinner. Likewise, because this was inside the mine, the surface was not even and there were probably a bunch of rocks. And so there's a possibility that maybe some of these early miners started to make the axle just a little bit thinner in order to have it pass above the rocks and in order to help them roll on somewhat uneven surfaces. And so trial after trial and roller after roller, we eventually got something thinner and thinner that started to resemble a wheel and an axle. And that's of course kind of what we get here in some of these wagon models as well. Because here we do have an axle and a wheel and not a roller at all. But in order to test this hypothesis, researchers behind the recent study, the study by James, Lecoq and Boulier, decided to examine this idea and simulate it using computer models. And the point was to start with a roller and then simulate the evolution of the roller into an actual wheel. And so here the algorithm modeled hundreds of different roller shapes, checking for mechanical advantage and structural strength, eventually evolving into the final shape that was essentially perfect. And pretty much every single time, it always ended up with a wheel and an axle. This was the optimal design, with the results of the simulation suggesting that the wheel was basically the perfect solution, and it's quite likely that these early civilizations managed to create this completely independently through trial and error. But this was probably a very long gradual process and did not happen right away. Either way, eventually, this would make these carts easier to push and these wheels much more efficient. And so according to the study and the explanation based on this computer model, there was no single invention moment. This was basically not some kind of a eureka. This was a very gradual process, resulting from a continuous accumulation of very small, very practical improvements, most likely the result of the environment, which was possibly not very easy to work in. So in this case, if this was a mine, it would make a lot of sense. A typical roller would not work very well inside the mine, so here you would have to evolve something to make things just a little bit better. But obviously the story of the wheel does not just end with the Carpathian miners, because the evolution of the wheel continued for many millennia. And even after these early innovations, as early as 200 years ago, a French bicycle mechanic managed to create something even more efficient. You can read about this in The Wheel by Richard Boulier, but here this was the invention of the radial ball bearings. Something that's conceptually identical to rollers, but in this case it's a rolling interface around the axle that prevents friction, bringing the wheel's evolution full circle. And even that is not the end of the story, because as recently as just a decade ago, NASA came up with even better wheels. And so here, since the beginning of the lunar exploration, with the lunar surface requiring a completely different way of transportation, NASA had to develop super elastic and airless tires, mostly because normal tires would just pop in the vacuum of space. With some of the newer wheels developed with the memory alloys, also known as SMAs or shape memory alloys, with one good example known as nitinol. That's because it's made out of nickel and titanium. And so these new tires can usually survive a lot more pressure, a lot more strain, and will always revert to their initial shape, while also not being puncturable, containing nothing inside, and basically being perfect for all other extraterrestrial locations. And so even though some of the previous designs, such as the ones used on Mars, eventually broke, these newly designed shape memory alloy tires can actually survive pretty much any condition. Which is technically why one day you'll probably be able to buy them and use them in a regular vehicle, once they become cheap enough. At least for now, they are just a little bit expensive. And so in essence here, the evolution of wheel has not stopped yet, with the engineers continuously improving the design and trying to create something that's perfect. Something that never breaks, something that works in all conditions, and something that can be applied to pretty much anything that requires wheels. We're not there yet, but because there's been so many advances in the last 10 years, chances are that in the next few decades, we're actually going to start seeing some of these in the use on the roads. Which essentially suggests that the evolution of the wheel has been actively going on for over 5,000 years, since those early wheels in the Carpathian Mountains. And so even though we often assume that some of the groundbreaking technologies emerge in a single flash, basically a eureka moment, here this investigation of the concept of the wheel suggests otherwise. It suggests that wheels went through countless quiet revolutions, most likely driven by practical needs and a continuous quest for improvement, and something that seems to agree with the archaeological evidence. And so that's the story of the wheel. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and in this video we're going to discuss some of the recent discoveries in regards to the phenomenon known as the Milankovitch cycles and their effects on the glaciation periods or the ice ages on planet Earth. And specifically, we're going to talk about a recent study by Stephen Barker and his team that potentially discovers the exact cycles responsible for the glaciation periods and even predicts the beginning of the next cycle, or basically the next ice ages. And so let's talk about some of these recent discoveries in more detail, but obviously first, let's briefly discuss the ice ages and how we believe it all started. And well, there's actually an older video on the channel that should be in the description that discusses this in more detail, but today scientists believe that approximately 2.5 million years ago, when the planet was going through some kind of a minor cooling period, there was actually an enormous collision with an asteroid anywhere from 1 to 4 kilometers in size that surprisingly left no crater, but it left behind a lot of leftovers which have been actually collected around certain areas in the Pacific Ocean. And it hit the planet somewhere right here. Today this is referred to as the Eltanin impact. The impact that most likely generated an enormous amount of evaporated water and huge tsunamis, signs of which have been discovered in various locations. Surprisingly here, the waves seem to be at least a few hundred meters in height. And so this very sudden disruption of the atmospheric composition is believed to have triggered the first ice age, or basically the formation of the ice caps, mostly in the northern hemisphere. And very likely because of the amount of water and the amount of salt suddenly introduced into the upper atmosphere. This very likely disrupted the ozone layer. This also very likely dramatically shifted the ice shelves, but most importantly caused the increase of the Earth's albedo or reflectivity, thus causing the planet to cool down. But instead of just staying permanently frozen, our planet actually started a kind of a cycle with a period of approximately 100,000 years. Usually we call these glacial interglacial cycles. Basically a kind of a periodic advance and retreat of the ice shelves in the northern hemisphere. And though at first it was not clear why this is happening, in the early 20th century, The Serbian mathematician Milankovitch proposed a potential explanation, and here it involved various cycles in regards to Earth's orbit. For example, cycles involving the changes in eccentricity, which seem to happen every 100,000 years, or changes in the obliquity, or essentially the tilt of the planet, which seems to occur every 41,000 years. Or maybe also axial precession, the wobble of the planet, which seems to change anywhere between 19,000 to possibly 26,000 years. This one is actually kind of funny because every single paper seems to give me a slightly different value. But we'll come back to this in a few seconds. And though at first this remained kind of hypothetical, it was eventually proven to be true with extremely robust geological evidence in 1976. So basically here, paleoclimatic records definitively confirm that the cycles seem to play some role. Specifically the role in regards to the glaciation periods, because in some sense they actually did match. With the last glaciation cycle beginning approximately 100,000 years ago, but ending 12,000 years ago, during which for approximately 10,000 years, a lot of mountains suddenly started growing huge ice sheets covering most of the northern hemisphere. And the cycle eventually ended approximately 12,000 years ago. So essentially now we're in the so-called interglacial period. But here the question was, of course, so what exactly starts the ice formation and how is it that it happens so fast? Interestingly, in a slightly older paper, scientists also wanted to find out why ice sheets were able to form in certain locations where we actually don't expect them at all. For example, places like Canada are expected to have them, but not places like Scandinavia that should have actually remained ice-free because of the so-called North Atlantic current. This current is one of the reasons why places like England and certain places in Scandinavia are actually much warmer than they should be. And well, the answer here was that at some point these ice sheets grow so large that they even block the current from passing, pretty much making everything here freeze completely. There's a really good explanation for how this works in a paper by Marcus Lofferstrom, and it even explains how a very similar mechanism involving ice sheets blocking warmer currents very likely also caused a dramatic drop in temperature during the so-called Younger Dryas period. This was a period approximately 12,000 years ago when there was a very sudden drop in temperature that has been connected to various currents in the Atlantic Ocean. But how does this connect to the Milankovitch cycles, and basically what exactly do they do? And so the point of this recent study was essentially to try to figure out which of these properties, eccentricity, precession, or obliquity, was the one most likely responsible for guiding the cycles, or discovering the specific roles for each of these properties. And in order to study this, here scientists analyzed approximately 900,000 years of the glaciation record, mostly focusing on independent records using oxygen isotopes collected by various teams from various ice cores. Now, in a lot of previous studies, there was actually a lot of difficulty in discovering exactly which cycle seems to do what, mostly because some of them seem to actually match. For example, cycle of precession, which can vary between 19 to 26,000 years, but is often approximately 21,000 years, seems to match with the second harmonic of obliquity cycle. Or in other words, 41,000 divided by 2 is approximately 20,500, which is extremely close to the cycle of precession, which means that it's hard to determine which of these cycles seems to be more important. Likewise, there's also something known as the 100,000-year problem. Essentially here, ice ages very often end at a specific interval that matches eccentricity cycles, but for reasons that are not entirely understood. In this case, eccentricity seems to change every 100,000 years, and this is when the Earth's orbit goes from being more circular to slightly more elongated. And so if we actually combine all of these cycles, we get a wave that kind of looks like this. And here, trying to compare this to glaciation periods can be very challenging. And so even today, nobody actually knows which of the cycles seems to produce the most effect. But in this new study, scientists potentially discovered the pattern that explains everything. And so here, by studying oxygen isotopes, they discovered that there was always a peak that seemed to match with very specific cycles, with transitions in glaciation periods directly aligning with certain periods in precession and obliquity. And the results here suggest that it's the precession that seems to usually trigger deglaciation. Or in other words, the wobble of the planet plays the biggest role in causing the ice ages to finally end. And so the data from the study suggests that ice ages seem to come to an end when the cycle of precession reaches its minimum. But usually during this time, the obliquity, or the tilt of the planet, starts to rise as well. Basically here, the tilt goes from approximately 22 degrees up to about 24 degrees. But intriguingly, during this time, because a lot of these cycles seem to match, eccentricity is also extremely low. So essentially here, Earth has a very circular orbit. And so even though deglaciation is triggered by precession, the other cycles obviously play a big role. But intriguingly, it's the obliquity, or once again the tilt of the planet, that seems to play the biggest role in sustaining very warm interglacial periods like the one we have right now. And more importantly, once the period here drops, or once the tilt decreases once again, this is usually what starts the next ice age. In other words, the glaciation seems to be the result of obliquity. Now, as you can see from this NASA simulation, the maximum obliquity is approximately 24.5 degrees, but current obliquity is approximately 23.5 degrees. And it's actually going down. Which is of course because this is a part of this long-term cycle that takes approximately 41,000 years. And so very soon it's going to be approximately 23.4 degrees and eventually go down to 22.1 degrees, at which point researchers believe this is going to be the beginning of the next ice age. And here they even calculated when this is most likely going to happen. Now here there's a side note in the study suggesting that this completely ignores the greenhouse emissions and a lot of human-caused climatic changes, but if we just look at the data based on the Milankovitch cycles, the next glaciation period should start in approximately 11,000 years. At this point, the axial tilt is going to be almost at its minimum. Although here there's obviously a really intriguing question. So those human emissions and stuff, how exactly would this affect the glaciation period? I mean, there's obviously no answer for this yet, but it would be very intriguing to find out if we're essentially causing some kind of a cancellation of the glaciation period and if it might never really happen. Which is, I guess, maybe, possibly, good news, kind of? At least for the Northern Hemisphere. But this is a pretty loaded topic and there are a lot of uncertainties here, and so obviously there's no answer. But I guess the other unanswered question here is really in regards to why this happens. Or to be more specific, why does obliquity seems to sustain these warm periods and seems to cause ice ages to start? Well, one of the potential answers provided here is really in regards to the total energy planet Earth receives over the year. If we combine the entire energy in summertime, especially at high latitudes, it's much higher when the tilt is over 24 degrees, and is much lower when the tilt gets closer to 22 degrees. And so here, because in summertime Earth receives less energy, it basically starts to cool down and eventually freeze, or at least start forming these huge glacial deposits. Interestingly, we know that on Mars, something very similar happens pretty much every few years, because of a misbalance between northern and southern hemisphere, which on Mars, instead of producing glaciation, actually produces enormous dust storms. And so this energy balance between the north and the south might be super important. But when it comes to axial precession or the wobble, it just seems to have a lot of influence during peak summer times, especially in the mid to high latitudes. And so as a result, during certain periods, Earth receives way more heat and thus causes deglaciation to start. But here even eccentricity plays a bit of a role too, with its biggest influence basically being on precession, and specifically the amplitude of precession. In other words, it seems to change the intensity of the wave, thus causing the precession to have more effects. So definitely a pretty cool study. But then there's one more thing I wanted to mention. So in the beginning of the video, I mentioned that for this study, they used the value for the precession to be 21,000 years. However, a lot of other studies seem to go with 23,000, and if you actually go to a lot of NASA websites, sometimes they list this as 26,000. And well, at first this might seem confusing, but that's because generally, calculated precession is exactly 26,000 years. But because of gravitational interactions with a lot of other planets, the real cycle goes between 19,000 and 23,000 years, and does change over time. Basically, the actual period depends on which planet do what. Now in this study, they chose the cycle to be 21,000 years, which is basically right in the middle. But because we know it can be 19,000 or 23,000, there's still maybe just a little bit of uncertainty when it comes to matching precession cycles with the observational data. In other words, even though the evidence from the study seems to be pretty good, there's still a possibility that maybe this is just way more complicated and there's actually something else at work. But at least for now, this is still a pretty cool explanation, and basically suggests that in the next 11,000 years, our planet might begin its next glaciation period. So let's start today's video with this beautiful map. The map showing world population in 2018. But what makes this map really interesting is that here each of the squares represents 500,000 people. And so in this case, the size of the country is directly proportional to the total population, which is why countries like Russia are so ridiculously tiny compared to their actual physical size. But the reason I wanted to start with the map is because, well, today, as you can probably tell from the title, we're going to be discussing the extinction event. We're going to be discussing this particular study that was just released a few days ago on the human extinction based on the changes in demographics around the planet, or essentially a kind of a hypothetical expiration date for the entire human species. And so this recent study, or technically this non-peer-reviewed paper, started to make headlines because of an extremely precise and very dramatic forecast. According to this research, we only have 314 years left. And though the current population is assumed to be about 8.1 billion people, according to the study, by the year 2339, the number will be 0. Humanity will be extinct. And so let's discuss this somewhat bizarre proposition in a bit more detail, look closely at the scientific claims behind this, and compare this to some of the more established predictions by various agencies. So here we're going to break down exactly what the authors discovered and how they discovered this, and what this tells us about future population trends. But I guess let's start with who wrote this and why they wrote this. And so here this was written by actual demographers, David Swanson and Jeff Tayman. And when they presented the study, according to their critics, it actually might have been to basically kind of maybe trap the press or bait unwary scientific journalists into some kind of a credulous, doom-laden coverage. So basically they were trying to make it go viral. But despite of this, the core mathematical structure they used does provide us with a very fascinating case study on how sometimes small assumptions can actually lead to very extreme and very incorrect results. And so just so that we're clear, it's extremely unlikely that we're actually going to go extinct anytime soon. But let's discuss the science first, and here I think it's important to start with methodology. How exactly was this achieved, and what tools were used? And here researchers used an advanced established mathematical tools normally utilized in population studies, such as what's known as cohort component method, CCM, and Hamilton-Perry method. CCM is a type of a projection technique that forecasts future population changes by using components of change such as fertility, migration, and mortality in order to predict future population size and age distribution. And it often produces something that kind of looks like this, or your typical population graph. And so normally by using this method, scientists can predict where the society is headed. Likewise, the Hamilton-Perry method projects future population based on 2 successive census counts, and specifically by trying to assess how the population changed within a short period of time. And so normally this requires much less data, but obviously does not always produce accurate results. And while normally when scientists use very similar tools, they basically end up with something like this, an extremely wide range of predictions for where the population is headed. And that's because it's actually very difficult to predict. And so the problem isn't really the tools, it's the specific input that's usually fed into the tools. And so in this particular case, in this study, the entire extinction idea depends on one key piece of recent data. It essentially only uses points from between 2019 and 2024, and then tries to extrapolate this, assuming that this is going to be the future of humanity. Now, here's what I mean. So during this period, the researchers, when looking at something called child-adult ratio, also known as CAR, the method that usually measures fertility rate, discovered that the ratio dropped by approximately 7.5%. In other words, they discovered that the fertility between 2019 and 2024 decreased by over 7%, which, as you probably know, would not be surprising. We've heard a lot of different stories about the fertility rates going down for several years. But you might also know that something else happened around this time that's actually kind of ignored, possibly on purpose, just to, I guess, make a point in terms of data. And so possibly something else affected the fertility rates, but in this case we're just looking at the numbers. But in reality though, fertility rates during a global crisis or a major social upheaval are very often unusual. And so in demographic studies, these types of periods usually provide very unstable and somewhat inaccurate data. So technically this should not be used for long-term prediction. But that was the foundation for this particular study. And so the assumption here is that this dramatic 7.5% drop in fertility is going to continue indefinitely, basically repeating every 5 years. And that's kind of what you see in this particular data. And when they plug this consistently steep decline into their projection model, the results become catastrophic, by the year 2139, which is 115 years from when I'm making this video, the world population drops to about 1.5 to maybe 1.8 billion people. By 2239, it's less than 6 million people, and by 2339, it's just cats everywhere. But basically, yeah, 0 people. And so the mathematical progression is dramatic and very unforgiving, with the authors themselves also noting the dramatic shifts in age structure. And so here we're talking about one of these population pyramids you might have seen before. And in their study by 2284, nobody in the world would be under the age of 20, and over 90% of population would be over 65 years old. Now this might sound extreme, but the thing is, in countries like Japan and South Korea, this is actually slowly becoming a reality. As a matter of fact, Japan right now is slowly becoming a kind of a case study for what might happen in a society where the aging population takes over and the youth basically slowly disappears. But obviously this is not really good science. While the prediction in this case is attention-grabbing, this methodology is of course not correct for one simple reason: extrapolation. You cannot extrapolate a pattern observed over a short, unusual 5-year period and then apply it for the next 3 centuries. So for example, if we do something similar for the period right after the Second World War, the assumption would be that the population on Earth should be in hundreds of billions within just the next few years. And so the scientists who made this dramatic forecast, either on purpose or by accident, failed to acknowledge the inevitable uncertainties involved in stretching a snapshot far into the future. And here it's important to look at why this type of extreme forecast ignores the realities of population dynamics, even though it uses legitimate analysis tools. The first obvious one is, of course, context. 2019 to 2024 was heavily influenced by major global events. But when it comes to demographics and forecasting population growth, it actually works best during very stable times, or when factors influencing various variables, such as for example birth rate, don't change too much over time. And so trying to isolate a temporary dip is essentially what completely invalidates this particular conclusion. Likewise, there's also something referred to as the black swan problem. Usually forecasts must account for highly improbable, high-impact events that we usually refer to as black swans. Conversely, the authors list many other potential extinction-level events like asteroid strikes, plagues, nuclear wars, or climate change, but argue that a continuous drop in birth rates actually gets us to the same point just much sooner. And for sociologists studying demographics and population growth, that's once again not a correct approach. And so this paper seems to lean heavily on sophisticated terminology and well-known established statistical methods, and then either on purpose or possibly just to go viral, creates a critical flaw in the core assumption and leads to an extremely skewed data, with that final date being 2339. And so yeah, just so that we're clear, the science in this particular paper is very, very bad. The only problem is that I don't know if it's on purpose, or basically as a kind of a joke, or if the scientists behind the study actually meant it. I mean, this would make sense if this was April 1st, but this was released right before Halloween. So maybe this was just to scare us. I don't know. But I guess to understand why this prediction seems to be kind of unrealistic and why practically no one thinks that in 314 years humans won't exist anymore, we possibly should look at some other predictions from other organizations such as the United Nations, and of course other research institutes. Although here, just for fun, I wanted to actually start with this. This is a human population graph from right after the end of the last glaciation period to now. And look at this ridiculous exponential growth. And just as a side note, that ridiculous growth right at the end can be directly attributed to some of the major advances in medicine and the invention of things like vaccines. As a matter of fact, there is a direct correlation between vaccination periods and dramatic reduction in mortality on the planet in just the last 200 years. So if you know any anti-vaxxers, maybe show them this graph. But in general, when trying to figure out the population growth, many of these groups also use very similar sophisticated models, but also rely on changing assumptions in regards to fertility, mortality, life expectancy, and a lot of other things. Which is why right now it's sort of unclear where the population growth is going to go. But the consensus is that we're not facing any imminent extinction anytime soon. The population is still growing, but that rate of growth is indeed decreasing. Not by 7.5% like in that particular study, but decreasing nevertheless. And intriguingly, the peak rate for the world population growth happened back in 1963. Here the growth was 2.2% every year. But as you can see from this graph, every year after this, the rate has been quite consistently declining. And so it was actually estimated at 1.1% around 2017. But importantly, when we look at the overall population growth since the Second World War, pretty much most of the reasons are attributed to major medical advances. Although at the same time we also had a dramatic increase in agricultural production, so here less sick people and more food allowed the population to grow really fast. And so technically, when looking at the future, most of the organizations today do agree that population is going to peak at some point, but definitely not go extinct in the next 300 years. So for example, the UN projection suggests a peak of approximately 10.3 billion people around the year 2080. But after this, the population might start decreasing. And interestingly, the UN also notes that in the long term, it's the total fertility rate that's probably going to decrease population the most. Now currently the fertility rate is 2.25, which is why the population is still growing just a little bit, but it is decreasing over time. And different agencies such as the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation predict something that's even lower. Here the peak might be 9.7 billion around 2064, with population declining below 9 billion by the year 2100. And so pretty much most of these mainstream models today show very similar results. The eventual peak and then the eventual decline, with the falling birth rates very likely being the main culprit. But it's not going to be sudden and dramatic like in this study. As a matter of fact, none of these predictions even established the final year. But interestingly, both this study and a lot of these other predictions basically settle on the same point: the rate of fertility. And so here, based on what we know about many developed countries, and even some of the emerging economies, the fertility rate has been dropping dramatically, even below these so-called replacement levels, with Japan being the first to reach this back in 2005. This was the first year Japan saw the population decline. But at the same time, the rapid population increase in regions like the sub-Saharan Africa and some of the less developed countries is why the global growth continues today and basically suggests a kind of a worldwide demographic transition. Although obviously this doesn't apply to all countries. For example, as we're going to be discussing in a different video, countries like India that are technically still emerging and developing have also seen a dramatic shift in population growth and an extreme decrease in fertility. And so technically the fertility rate is going down everywhere. But this study that claims the extinction by 2339 is an excellent example of how the presentation of extreme conclusions, supported by somewhat selective data and also sophisticated methods, can indeed lead us to conclusions that might sound scientifically correct are actually completely wrong. And so here, based on what we know about other studies, the foundations for this particular prediction are almost certainly incorrect. And so in reality, the complex future of humanity and the population growth is mostly going to be guided by a more gradual social and economic factors, and not by some kind of an extreme extrapolation based on one single event. And so based on some of the most accurate projections, we know that moving forward, there might be a much slower growth and possibly a multi-century decline in population, but it's extremely unlikely to be a sudden crash and a sudden disappearance of a species. Which is a really important reminder that you shouldn't always read just the title and just the headline of the paper, but to always question the assumptions and try to figure out how the conclusion was actually reached. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss some of the recent and somewhat mysterious discoveries coming from right here, our planet Earth. The discoveries in regards to something inside the planet that once again is somewhat difficult to explain and currently makes no sense. And in this case involves the discovery of somewhat unusual, never before seen hidden structures that seem to be in a lot of different locations on the planet underneath the crust, but whose origin is currently impossible to explain. And so let's discuss this in a little bit more detail, but also let's start with the obvious. In the last decade or so, because of the advances in seismic detectors and also the overall increase in computing power, it actually became relatively easy for a lot of different geologists to extremely accurately study the internal structure of our own planet. And that's because we have a lot of different seismic receivers on the planet, all capable of detecting even minor earthquakes. And here, these earthquakes and the waves they produce basically serve as a kind of ultrasound. They allow us to see inside the planet and allow us to uncover a lot of hidden structures by basically detecting how fast or how slow certain waves move in certain locations. So basically all these seismographs that constantly detect and record earthquakes allow us to calculate internal structure of the planet by calculating the speed of each wave, which then determines what's inside. And that's because the speed of these waves depends on what kind of a wave it is and the overall density of material they pass through. Or to be more specific, the density and the elasticity. which is essentially how the scientists eventually discovered the presence of these huge structures we refer to as LLSVPs, or large low shear velocity provinces, that we've discussed previously in a lot of different videos, because even today it's not entirely clear what actually produced these enormous structures, but they either represent ancient continents or potentially leftovers from the ancient planet that collided with planet Earth. But on top of this, in some of the recent videos, we also discussed the discovery of an additional core inside the planet, the so-called innermost core, and a lot of other bizarre features, such as huge chunks of seafloor, discovered in just the last few months. So basically, in just the last few years, there's been a lot of different discoveries. You can learn about some of them in some of the videos in the description. But here the principle was always the same. By listening to these waves from various locations, it becomes possible to find areas where the rock, for example, seems to be colder or potentially has different composition. So basically, in certain locations, the earthquake waves seem to act a little bit differently. And so based on these unusual anomalies, geophysicists can usually find unusual structures or even reveal certain composition inside the mantle, or in some cases even inside the core, allowing us to understand and study our own planet without physically going there, drilling into it, and trying to collect samples, which by the way, even today would practically be impossible. Even today, one of the deepest holes is only like 12 kilometers in depth. And so when it comes to research involving geophysics, and specifically research involving plate tectonics, or basically the movement of continents and their interaction over time, surprisingly, a lot of previous theories so far have basically been proven correct by studying geological deposits underneath the crust within the mantle by using these ultrasound techniques. And so, for example, researchers here expected to find a lot of different sunken continental plates very close to various subduction zones, where we know one of the plates sinks under the other, eventually forming some kind of a deposit inside the mantle. And so quite a lot of these tectonic plates that have sunk over time have actually been discovered very close to subduction zones as predicted, which did confirm a lot of theories of plate tectonics and helped us understand how all of this works. As a matter of fact, most of our geological understanding and the understanding of how the planet evolved in the last 4.5 billion years is kind of based on many of these assumptions that have basically been proven correct so far. But turns out that this plate tectonic cycle might still have some secrets, and these secrets have now officially been revealed based on even more complex simulations and even more complex analysis that managed to use the data from all of these seismic receivers combined with the analysis by a supercomputer, specifically this one, PIS-DAINT, located in the Swiss Alps, that allowed the scientists behind the recent study in the description, so Thomas Schutten and his team, to essentially create the highest resolution model we've ever had of all possible anomalies on the entire planet, going as deep as 1,000 kilometers. And though this model once again confirmed the presence of these plates close to various subduction zones, it also discovered something entirely different. Here it discovered very similar formations that actually resemble submerged plates, or possibly some other really dense structures formed by something else entirely, in locations where nobody expected them. In most cases under very large oceanic or continental plates, where there are basically no subduction zones, or no other zones that should be able to produce something similar. As a matter of fact, in most of these locations, there is no evidence of any kind of subduction activity, no presence of previous plates, and no explanation for how something like this could have formed. Right now, these are just anomalies. And the only reason it was just discovered in the early 2025 is because of this newly created model known as the procedure full waveform inversion that required all of the seismic detectors in order to produce this observation. And naturally, because it was so computationally expensive, here they also needed a supercomputer. But the question right now is, what exactly are these? What are these lost worlds that seem to be located in many places, with the biggest ones being in the Pacific Ocean and under South America? And well, for geologists, right now this is a really big mystery, because there's really no model that would explain any of this, and current plate tectonic theories suggest that these should not exist and there should actually be nothing there. Which basically means that there is something we still don't understand about the internal dynamics inside planet Earth, and it looks like our planet is able to produce these huge, massive structures using some kind of a technique we still don't understand. Or what this means for the evolution of planet Earth, and how this affects the planet over time. Although funnily enough, one of the researchers basically tried to explain this in layman terms by using a common comparison with a typical ultrasound you might get from a doctor. Here he basically compares this to a doctor examining blood circulation with ultrasound, discovering a lot of different arteries, but then finding one where he really doesn't expect, in someone's buttocks. I mean, it was a pretty funny analogy, and it does actually reflect what was discovered in this study, so I thought why not include it in this video. So yeah, basically, these discoveries are kind of like finding an artery inside someone's butt. But right now the explanations are sort of missing. I mean, there are some, but none of them are concrete. For example, one explanation here is that this is not just material from the last millions of years, but could actually be extremely ancient material, very likely rich in silica and a lot of heavier elements, that's been there since the formation of the mantle approximately 4 billion years ago. So in some sense, maybe this is just leftovers from ancient Earth that has not changed much over time. And that's despite the convection inside the mantle that should have destroyed it a long time ago. Alternative explanation here involves something different. Maybe this is iron-rich rocks that possibly accumulate as a result of mantle movement, in this case forming unusual focus points where the mantle motion basically brings everything in a certain region on the planet, where it then accumulates over time. But the reality is that all of these are just assumptions for now, and there is really no explanation. As a matter of fact, this is just another new mystery from inside the planet that once again highlights how little we know about the planet and how much we still have to learn. I mean, for all we know, maybe these are actually just tiny layers that were shed from the crust itself that for some reason remain in the mantle and were never recycled. And so until we actually find a way to determine what's inside these anomalies and what they're made out of, it's going to be relatively challenging to determine their actual origin. But one thing is certain though, previous models need to be reworked, and because these structures seem to be quite widespread and seem to be present in many locations, this definitely creates a bit of a challenge for the modern understanding of plate tectonics. Another mystery from planet Earth that needs to be resolved in the future, and something we'll come back and talk more about in some of the future videos. So here I was trying to make some kind of a super interesting video about Martian scientific discoveries when everyone on the internet started to talk about yet another unusual image from the surface of Mars that's probably aliens or extraterrestrial intelligence building structures on the surface. Alright, let's discuss these pyramids everyone's talking about and why it's probably not aliens and why it's just a geological feature. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton. Let's take a look at the picture first, and let's actually discuss the Martian surface and a lot of different intriguing features on the surface imaged in the last few months, discussing what we'll learn about Mars in the process, but also talk about some of the dramatic shifts and dramatic changes Mars is currently going through. But here's that image. This was trending on Twitter and a few other social networks for the last few days, and obviously raised a lot of eyebrows. A discovery of what seems to be some kind of an ancient pyramid on Mars, I guess, maybe? Except that, as always, this is maybe just a little bit fake. Fake because if you actually look on the bottom, there's also a link to some kind of a website which seems to be related to UFOs. And that's because this is not the real image that was posted by NASA a few days back. The real image looks like this. And though there is still a bit of a square shape in here, even here things were kind of processed. And so let's go take a look at the actual image posted by NASA, which you can find in the description below, and try to discover what's really there. So first of all, if you follow the link in the description, you'll notice that this image is unusually long vertically. As a matter of fact, you have to keep scrolling up and up until you find that shape we're looking for. And that's because, oh yeah, here it is. Here's that square. And that's because this image was taken by the Martian orbiter, specifically Mars Global Surveyor, that's been here for quite some time and contains its Mars orbiter camera that's able to take pictures pretty much actively as it orbits the planet. But if you're old enough, this image might remind you of something else. The famous Face on Mars, taken by the Viking 1 back in 1976. This was obviously also very bizarre and very unusual, and even led to at least one episode of the X-Files. But as we've discovered within just a few years, and especially by reconstructing the structure in 3 dimensions, there was no face, it was just a very bizarre mountain. Which is pretty much the same thing here. This might resemble some kind of a square or even some kind of a buried pyramid, but if you look closer you'll notice that it's far from being a perfect square and actually does resemble a typical mountain range, and a relatively small mountain approximately 3 kilometers across. But then we get these fake edited images on the web and it suddenly becomes the center of everyone's attention. Obviously though, this is very different from this, and this is definitely not some kind of a buried alien structure. As a matter of fact, here on Earth, we even have natural mountains that look more pyramid-like and have also raised ufologists' eyebrows back in the days. One of the more famous ones is this, the bizarre pyramid in Antarctica. Except that this is not a pyramid, and scientists have visited this place many times because it's also very famous for a lot of different fossils. This is just one of the peaks in the Ellsworth Mountains, which have been very thoroughly explored and explained in a study right here that you can also find in the description. No pyramids, no aliens, no extraterrestrials, nothing but very beautiful mountains. And today we know that this is most likely the result of a very special type of carving through hundreds of millions of years of erosion, the result of what's known as free-thaw erosion, which is basically when you have a lot of water and a lot of snow go through its cycles for many years. And specifically when water and tiny pieces of snow fill cracks inside the mountain and then freeze at night, with the ice expanding and slowly breaking the mountain apart. This basically causes gaps inside the rock to grow larger and larger over time, resulting in a lot of pressure that slowly breaks the mountain apart, forming these bizarre shapes. And we know this freeze-thaw phenomenon exists in a lot of places. Here's another famous mountain, Matterhorn, formed in a very similar way. And so likewise, this is also a result of some kind of an erosion, but exactly what kind is obviously unknown to us. And that's because Mars is just very different from Earth. Here, the water cycle would just not exist, and instead, we would actually have some kind of a carbon dioxide cycle that would produce different erosion. Erosion that's most likely caused by both the wind on Mars and the transition of carbon dioxide into the solid form, which then turns it back into gas when it gets warmer. Now when it comes to wind, for example, we know that based on some of the recent Ingenuity measurements, the winds on Mars are much stronger than we thought. Previously, the average wind speed was expected to be approximately 10 to 15 meters per second, but Ingenuity regularly measured winds at least double the speed, up to 25 meters per second, detectable just a few weeks ago. And so if there are a lot of strong winds, we would obviously expect a lot of erosion. But right now, in the last few weeks, researchers have been actually observing Mars for this exact reason. We actually get to see a lot of these changes and a lot of this erosion in real time, because Mars is currently going through its New Year changes. It's going through one of the most active and even one of the most explosive periods when things on the surface start to change, as the surface in some regions is warming up. And that's because right now this planet is getting more and more active as the spring begins, and we get to see many of these changes in pretty much real time. For example, the ice on its poles is changing, but so are the individual structures around the entire Martian surface. And that's because here, as I mentioned before, there is really no liquid cycle, but there is a CO2 cycle, and that cycle is just a little bit different. Instead of ice turning into liquid and melting, here ice just becomes gas right away and sublimates. And the sublimation on Mars can be a little bit explosive. Explosive enough to suddenly create huge geysers on the surface and transform the surface almost right away. And so here, as light shines through some of this carbon dioxide and heats up the bottom, it basically causes a sudden sublimation event where most of this ice suddenly becomes gas and then just explodes, which then creates these very bizarre fan-like formations coming from within Mars. And sometimes after these eruptions, they'll often leave these bizarre marks on the surface we refer to as spiders, mostly because all of this ice inside is now gone and the surface above it starts to crumble. And here's actually a really cool picture that you might have not seen before of what the scientists now refer to as Martian kidney beans. Except that here this is just Martian dunes with a lot of ice between them. These are basically frozen sand dunes on Mars in the northern hemisphere. And here all of these dunes are covered by a tiny layer of carbon dioxide, which is kind of like frost here on Earth, which actually stops the wind from scooping up the sand and prevents these dunes from migrating just like they usually do on planet Earth. So basically normally dunes are not actually stable formations, they do move across the surface, but very slowly as the sand migrates. But when there's so much frost, they don't. They freeze on the surface and stay in the same spot until the frost disappears. And so during the springtime, which is technically now, all of this frost will disappear and the dunes will become mobile once again. And so sometimes in the next 2 years, none of this will be here and it will all look very different. And very similar changes are visible in a lot of other locations, mostly in the North Pole. For example here, all of the bright spots are frozen CO2 that's now sublimating and spreading a lot of darker materials on the surface. This image by NASA basically shows us what most likely happens here, which basically means that Mars might be a lot less desirable to settle on compared to what we usually think. So basically here, every 2 years, you get these super explosive geysers, also very likely extremely loud geysers, that explode all over the surface as all of this ice sublimates producing this very bizarre terrain. And so even though spring on Earth might be more romantic and involves a lot of flowers and melted ice, on Mars it's just maybe a little bit explosive. It also involves a lot of frost avalanches, where you basically get these huge chunks of CO2 ice crashing down from the mountains, not to mention very powerful winds and even storms. But apart from all of these explosions and all of this falling ice, there's also a lot of dust devils. Something that we knew existed on Mars for over a decade now, because this was one of the first ones captured by the Martian orbiter. And here dust devils are essentially like tornadoes, but I guess not as powerful. And while in this image, you get to see their tracks, or technically what the tracks of these dust devils left as they move across the surface and as they deposit dust in various locations where they passed. And this is actually an incredible image that we've never seen before, that basically confirms there are a lot of dust devils on Mars, and they're always created when the surface heats up, causing warm air to rise rapidly, in a very similar fashion to tornadoes on planet Earth. And just like tornadoes, they can last for hours, travel for tens of kilometers, leaving a certain mark on the surface that in this case resembles various dust trails. And though this is unlikely to be dangerous to astronauts, it will definitely affect solar panels, and depending on the speed of the particles, may cause abrasion of some of the more sensitive electronics. So definitely a really cool picture, and something we'll be hearing more about in some of the future studies. But at the same time, all of these changes on the surface, and specifically the warming up of the surface, is now most likely going to result in a famous Martian storm. And that's because in one of the recent studies, researchers investigated the surface changes and the onset of dust storms, correlating the amount of solar radiation, especially in certain locations on Mars, with predictions for the appearance of the enormous storms on Mars. With a separate study that used several observations from the Mars Global Surveyor that involved approximately 10 years of observations, researchers discovered that Mars tends to absorb energy slightly different depending on its hemispheres. So basically here, the Martian northern hemisphere tends to absorb and re-emit heat differently from the southern hemisphere. We're actually going to discuss why these hemispheres are so different in a separate video that's coming out really soon, so do subscribe if you'd like to find out more. But essentially here the discovery was that there's a different excess of energy in the northern hemisphere compared to the southern hemisphere, with all of this excess very likely causing the beginning of the storms. And that's compared to planet Earth, where things are more or less equal and the energy manages to balance out year after year. But on Mars, the energy surplus very likely triggers a lot of these global dust storms, and very likely as a result of the southern hemisphere warming up. It essentially causes a lot of dust particles to suddenly start kicking up the storms, as all of this extra energy has to go somewhere. And because these storms become so massive, they essentially cover Mars from the sun, which then reduces the solar radiation and eventually cools Mars down. And so just to summarize this, these storms seem to result from seasonal imbalances due to major differences in the northern hemisphere compared to the southern hemisphere, with all of the calculations and all of the details available in the study right here by Larry Guan. But all of these studies and all of these observations once again show us that Mars is just very, very different. And though there are some similarities to planet Earth, there are still a lot of differences even when it comes to erosion. Which is why we actually do find bizarre shapes like this, phenomena like this, or any of those other strange rocks discovered previously that we discussed in many videos before. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss some of the more unusual discoveries when it comes to planet Earth. But specifically discoveries in regards to Earth's gravity and a somewhat unusual gravitational anomaly that was just discovered by accident in one of the recent studies. And normally these gravitational anomalies reveal secrets hidden deep beneath the surface that traditional surface geology could never uncover. And so today we're going to discuss some of these recent discoveries and compare them to some of the similar discoveries from the moon, and of course discuss this most fundamental phenomenon or this force on the planet, gravity. But first, let's briefly discuss how we know all of this and how this is usually studied. Because a lot of these incredible discoveries could not be possible without specific satellite missions. And I think this one right here is probably the most important and the most famous of them all. This is a pair of NASA satellites referred to as GRACE, Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment, that's been going on for at least 2 decades. And the point of this mission is pretty simple: mapping the entire planet and trying to identify various irregularities when it comes to various values for surface gravity. And so here the point is to try to discover the actual gravity value compared to what's expected or what's predicted based on a theoretically perfectly smooth Earth model. Because these gravitational anomalies do exist everywhere, and that's because none of the objects in the solar system, including our own planet, are perfectly spherical or uniform. And because gravity is directly proportional to mass, and also since different materials inside the planet will usually have different density, they're going to create slightly different gravitational pull, and they're going to produce slightly different values for gravity in every location on the planet. Now, the actual differences are very minuscule, but they're still there. And in order to measure all of this, scientists came up with this very brilliant mission. It essentially uses twin spacecraft orbiting extremely close to one another, and they orbit in such a way that they can actually see each other, projecting lasers as you can see in this picture. And so here, as the first satellite passes over a certain area, if it detects slightly stronger gravity, it's actually going to speed up momentarily, which will change the distance between satellites and will be visible because of these very precise laser observations. And really because of, well, lasers. They're just such an incredible tool for super precise measurements. And so here, by precisely measuring changing distances, researchers can then start mapping the gravity of every single point these satellites pass over, which is of course where you usually get something like this. Now this is extremely exaggerated, but this essentially shows you slight field anomalies measured in milligauss. And for this to make sense, we have to understand what these milligauss are. Milligauss is essentially a measurement of gravitational change, with the Earth's standard gravity being approximately 980 gauss or 980,000 milligauss. In case you're wondering, gal here stands for Galileo. And 1 gal represents 1 centimeter per second squared. And so you can see that some of the values are approximately 50 milligal, which is almost nothing compared to 980,000 that represents the average on the planet. But nevertheless, these values are quite specific and quite significant. And as you can see in certain regions on the planet, there are unusual anomalies, specifically positive anomalies and negative anomalies. Now, positive anomalies usually occur where the measured gravity is just a little bit stronger, and this normally indicates the presence of dense subsurface material, like for example some kind of a metallic ore, or maybe dense oceanic crust. And so here this can actually be used in detecting new mining materials, or in trying to map the invisible plate tectonics. So this is essentially useful for both mining industries and geologists. And the negative anomalies, which are obviously produced by slightly lower gravity, usually represent massive basins filled with light sedimentary rock, or potentially unusually thick continental crust. So this is what you see right there in Africa, which makes it a vital tool for planetary exploration, or technically even lunar exploration, because something very similar was also done on the moon. And so, for example, for mining, when scientists detect some kind of a negative anomaly, this can help delineate sedimentary basins, which very often hold oil and gas reserves, because these rocks are usually much less dense compared to surrounding basement rock. Whereas the positive anomalies can reveal extremely rich iron deposits or any other dense metal. But for geologists or scientists trying to understand the planet, this is also how we can study plate tectonics and even the structure underneath, such as the crust and the mantle. Because here gravity maps are perfect for revealing faults, folds, or structures inside the planet and discovering boundaries between Earth's crust and the denser mantle below. And so essentially this is one of the most important tools for geological sciences. But it's recently also become super important for studying climatic changes. Because here over the years, GRACE became essential for what's known as time-variable gravity data. Essentially changes in gravity fields that seem to happen over months or years, and which seem to be the result of redistribution of water on the surface. And this includes tracking groundwater, melting glaciers, and changes in the sea level as well. So this is a crucial tool for hydrology and climate forecasting, which is what it's basically been used for the past few years. And so when you hear about any studies involving changes in water distribution, that's usually where this data comes from. And the data here is super accurate, because here even millimeter changes are usually observable and visible to these satellites. But this is where we come to today's mystery and this somewhat bizarre observation. Because for decades, scientists believed that a lot of these time-variable gravity signals would probably be coming from various surface processes, such as water, ice, or maybe atmospheric mass shifts. Which is of course what you can actually see in here, based on these previous maps made over the years. But this is where things get bizarre, because A recent analysis that came out just a few days ago uncovered some really bizarre data that didn't make sense. A very strange event that originated far deeper than anyone predicted and seems to have happened between 2006 and 2008. So essentially this happened over a decade ago, but somehow was missed until now. And the peak for this event apparently happened in January of 2007. And this was an anomalous, large-scale gravity signal that seemed to have emerged over the eastern Atlantic Ocean. This is essentially what you see in these pictures. And interestingly enough, this was not a small event. It seems to have spanned approximately 7,000 kilometers or about 5,000 miles, which reflected a significant mass redistribution. And here researchers spent a lot of time comparing the observations against every known process, and it basically confused them for a very long time. For example, models shifting water or any kind of atmospheric changes just did not make any sense. This signal could not be explained by either water or atmosphere because it was just too powerful, and the amount of water required to produce this would be just unrealistic. And this forced the scientists to come up with a different hypothesis and a different explanation. Here they had to go down thousands of kilometers below the surface, down to what's known as D layer, a layer located near the boundary between the mantle and the outer liquid core. And here at a depth of 3,000 kilometers, they possibly discovered the source. And here the evidence points at something that's not expected at all. An extremely rapid density change deep within the Earth's solid interior, and very likely resulting from some kind of a mineral phase transition that happened in just 2 years. Or basically, there was some kind of a chunk of stuff that then transitioned from one phase to the other, kind of like water changing into ice, which basically changed its density, and that affected the gravity. And this study is so detailed that they even identified what most likely changed. The material in question is the mineral referred to as brigmanite, also sometimes referred to as a silicate perovskite. And it just so happens that under extreme pressures and under extreme temperatures, which we obviously do find inside the planet, this mineral can change its crystalline structure from perovskite to post-perovskite, which sort of resembles this. And this change usually involves a dramatic density increase, which can obviously affect gravitational measurements. And since in this case the temperature generally determines the depth where this occurs, here it was most likely triggered by some kind of a vertical motion, for example material rising from the base of the mantle, which possibly caused the transformation, with all of this happening extremely fast. So once again kind of imagine ice melting and becoming water, just because it went from somewhere much colder to somewhere much warmer. But interestingly, the movement of this material was extremely close to another geological mystery, African Large Low Shear Velocity Province, LLSVP. The bizarre structures inside the planet that we discussed in some of the previous videos in the description, whose origin is still not certain, but that obviously influenced the planet in certain ways. And so here this change caused a rapid mass redistribution, very likely affecting the African LLSVP and making it shift a little bit. And what's even more interesting is that apparently this event also coincided with something else, a somewhat unrelated anomaly in the Earth's magnetic field. So here this event spatially and temporarily coincided with a geomagnetic jerk, or basically a sudden rapid change in the variation of the magnetic field, which seems to have happened around the same time. And so this connection suggests that these deep mantle mass redistributions may directly influence the fluid core motion that generates the magnetic field as well. And though it's not entirely clear how all of this connects yet, these incredible new discoveries will most likely lead to some really important explanations about what happens inside planet Earth. But right now, researchers believe that this phase change very likely caused the topography inside the planet to change just enough to shift things by about 12 centimeters every 2 years, which is what was observed in 2007 and why we saw so many anomalies during this year. And these discoveries are also important because they essentially offer us a unique window into the rapid dynamics inside our own planet, proving that the solid mantle, even at its base, can undergo some relatively fast structural shifts that only take a few months at most. And shifts that can even impact observations in gravitational fields and even affect the magnetic field as well. But here, just for funsies, let's maybe also take a look at our partner, the Moon, because for many decades the Moon has also been studied quite thoroughly and has also been mapped by very similar missions. And that's because unlike Earth, the Moon is relatively solid and relatively stable, and so here various anomalies usually tell us a little bit more about the ancient events that shaped this object. And for decades, scientists noticed something really strange. A lot of spacecraft orbiting the Moon, especially over large impact craters, would routinely veer off course. And so having a permanent and stable orbit around the moon has always been extremely difficult. And so it turns out that compared to planet Earth, the moon's gravity field is incredibly bumpy. Which becomes pretty obvious when you look at this map, or when you compare the anomalies to our own planet. Here, a lot of the gravitational anomalies are usually 6 to even 10 times more powerful. And so today a lot of these mass concentrations are referred to as mascons, with the mysteries surrounding their formation once again largely resolved by similar twin missions, in this case referred to as GRAIL. The satellites that kinda look like this. GRAIL stands for Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory. And so this GRAIL data show that a lot of these mascons don't just create strong centers of gravity, they often appear with a very unusual bullseye pattern. A center of strong positive gravity surrounded by alternating rings of weaker and stronger gravities. And the reason why the moon seems to have this is its violent past. So basically a lot of these large asteroid impacts that the moon experienced over the years seems to have produced most of these bizarre anomalies. But turns out that these bullseye patterns only formed under specific conditions, when the asteroid struck much thinner crust, and specifically because this allows the denser material from the underlying mantle to then rise toward the surface, concentrating mass near the surface and creating these bizarre mascons. But the areas of the moon with much thicker crust resisted these formations, with impacts not resulting in any of these mascons or these bullseyes. And so by comparing the gravity anomalies on Earth and the moon, it really shows us how fundamentally different a lot of planets and moons seem to be. And so on the moon, the gravity anomalies are primarily fossilized geological records. A lot of them are billions of years old and have not changed much for a long time. And they essentially reflect ancient cataclysmic impacts that left permanent mass concentrations trapped beneath the surface. Actually, most of them occurred during the late heavy bombardment over 3 billion years ago. But on Earth, gravity anomalies are both static and dynamic and allow us to study so much more. For example, these static anomalies help us map stable geological structures like mineral deposits, or even understand plate tectonics, whereas the dynamic parts help us understand the changes in the water and atmospheric pressures, or even learn about these bizarre structures underneath the planet. And so these are definitely super important studies, and even help us challenge the traditional view about the deep mantle and the locations near the core. Even though we always thought these were extremely slow processes, this study based on the observations from 2007 tells us otherwise. And so this is not just academic, this is about building a comprehensive model of planetary behavior, and about understanding somewhat surprising and still poorly understood workings of planet Earth. And as always, you can learn about all of this in a study by Charlotte Anton and the team you see on the screen. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss a somewhat unusual but also somewhat unnerving report that basically talks about potential dangers for what's known as mirror life, or specifically mirror bacteria. And though as I describe this to you, it might sound like some kind of a science fiction scenario, turns out that this could actually be an extremely dangerous phenomenon for the future of the planet, and something that a lot of scientists are now officially warning about. And here we're actually talking about something that would be a new extinction event if this ever became real. And so let's discuss this in more detail, but I guess let's start with the basics of biology first. Let's talk about chirality. And chirality is a topic you might remember from basic biology. The idea that things tend to come in two different shapes, either left-handed or right-handed. So basically it's a type of an asymmetry that actually applies to a lot of different sciences, with the most famous example usually used in various biological and chemical classes basically being our hands. Both are a type of a mirror image. But this idea of handedness is particularly important in organic chemistry. And that's because mirror molecules usually form in equal amounts, but can actually have extremely different effects and functions depending on what they are. And today we have certain examples that are pretty well known. And one of the most famous examples is the molecule known as carbon, a molecule that a lot of university classes very often use as an example to prove this point. Carbon also comes as either left-handed or right-handed, and depending on the handedness, it can either smell like spearmint or a type of a seed known as caraway. In other words, the mirror molecules in this case react differently inside our nose. They attach to different sense receptors, making them smell differently depending on the handedness. And though this is a really simple example, Some examples are a little bit more extreme. And it doesn't get more extreme than thalidomide, an extremely powerful drug that was prescribed many years ago as a treatment to morning sickness. And it actually does work really well. Turns out though, thalidomide, which also exists in two forms, in one of its forms can cause devastating birth effects, which unfortunately was not known until it started to cause these effects, affecting a lot of pregnant women and their children over the years. And so examples like thalidomide show us how extreme this can get and how in some cases handedness can be very dangerous. But also shows us that this is something we can physically create and something we can physically control. And while in the last decade, and especially in the last few years, this idea of generating mirror molecules, and specifically mirror peptides, has actually become even more popular. Here's one such paper from just a year ago, in January of 2024, that sequenced a mirror image of a very large ribosomal protein, with the technique in this case, in theory, potentially useful for a lot of medical reasons. Here's the example from this study. And so basically by creating a mirror image of a protein, it might become possible to create something that can actually function as some kind of a medicine or something that can destroy viruses and bacteria in our body without being detected by our immune systems, thus allowing it to function much longer. In other words, it becomes possible to create a protein that our body does not detect and does not destroy, but can actually still be therapeutic. And a lot of this started back in 2016 when the Harvard scientist George Church created a mirror version of a DNA polymerase. So this is actually a relatively recent idea, but the idea that was based entirely on curiosity and essentially seeing if we can even make this happen. However, because this field advanced really quickly, now the same scientist, and actually a lot of other scientists, 38 to be specific, published this technical report warning everyone that this can lead to something extremely dangerous. And mostly because of studies like this that take this to a completely new level, mixing synthetic cell engineering and nanotechnology in order to combine a lot of these mirror proteins and potentially create mirror life, or at least mirror bacteria. Now, we've actually discussed a lot of these synthetic bacteria in some of the previous videos you can find in the description, but in the last few years, researchers have already been super successful at basically creating synthetic bacteria through extremely thorough genetic modification. This idea of synthetic biology that began in the 80s has now become very effective and has also become a very active field. But now some scientists are thinking of combining these fields, which would basically result in mirror bacteria or synthetic life that mirrors natural life. Or just to rephrase this, life that would be formed from mirror molecules and mirror proteins. Although here it's really important to understand something about life that we see around us. That's of course including you and me. All of the amino acids inside of us, all of the building blocks of proteins, are left-handed, while all of the sugars are right-handed. As a matter of fact, DNA is also right-handed as well. Now we don't actually know exactly why this is so, and this is one of the biggest mysteries in nature and in biology, but there have been some propositions trying to explain this, including one involving cosmic rays. The video in the description talks about this more. And so this selective chirality is super important for a lot of living systems. Mostly because it's a defining feature of the entire biosphere, and all of the chemical reactions inside of us depend on this handedness. But what if suddenly we have a bunch of bacteria or a bunch of viruses made entirely out of left-handed DNA, which would now be basically a mirror image? And while we know that technically building these mirror biological molecules is already achievable, a lot of mirror enzymes have been created over the years, and a lot of them for various medical reasons. But the studies like this, that essentially is trying to build the entire bacteria from the ground up by using these mirror molecules, is literally what the scientists are trying to warn us about, because we don't know where this goes. If such bacteria were to be created, in theory, it could technically become completely immune to all immune systems on the planet. For example, if one were to get infected by such bacteria, our immune system would be completely ineffective against it and would not be able to evolve and adapt for millions and millions of years. And because here the molecules and the entire structure would be identical to a normal bacteria, it would function in a very similar way. And so if something like this were to escape from some kind of a lab out there, it could literally cause an extinction event. For example, nothing that eats bacteria usually would be able to consume this because it would be completely useless to them, since mirror molecules are not digestible. None of the digestive enzymes would work on these bacteria, and it could also be completely immune to various viruses. Normally in nature, viruses control the bacterial growth and can actually be used to prevent infections, But a typical virus would not affect mirror bacteria because it would just not see it and would not be able to act on it. And since the entire biosphere of the planet is based on these left-handed amino acids, anything that comes into existence with right-handed amino acids can potentially completely displace everything, even outcompeting other bacteria in the same niche. In other words, a right-handed amino acid bacteria that suddenly comes into the same niche would simply displace anything else because no virus and no enzyme can do anything to it. It can literally take over the entire planet without anything affecting it. Or at least that's the idea behind this report and what the scientists are warning against, because technically it's a real possibility. Although the main point is that the effects would be completely unpredictable and we have no idea what this would cause. I mean, technically, a lot of antibiotics we use do actually depend on chirality of molecules, and so in that sense we have absolutely nothing to fight these bacteria, which honestly would also make for an excellent science fiction story or possibly some kind of a horror movie. Except that this is a real valid concern and something that could one day become a problem. Luckily though, we're still at least a decade away from scientists being able to create something in a lab that would be an actual functioning organism made entirely out of mirror molecules. Right now we can only produce individual molecules or possibly individual proteins, but not the entire DNA and not thousands of proteins required for mirror life. But the report itself is very detailed and actually goes through a lot of different examples and a lot of different explanations for why we need to take this seriously. As a matter of fact, this report is 300 pages long and goes through all possible scenarios, highlighting certain species that can become dominant on the entire planet. So we have this one example here that can completely displace certain types of single-cell organisms, thus collapsing the food chain. And so hopefully scientists working on the mirror life and mirror bacteria will not take it too far. Otherwise we might have something else to worry about and something else that can take us closer to that extinction. But in this case, something that we would not even see and something that we might even have trouble fighting. Nevertheless, this is still a super fascinating idea and something we'll talk about in some of the future videos. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss a somewhat intriguing experiment conducted by scientists from MIT University, and specifically a fascinating experiment involving quantum mechanics, revisiting one of the most iconic and mind-bending concepts when it comes to light. Light's dual nature. The idea behind light being potentially both particle and a wave, and the idea that was explored as far back as 100 years ago. But as I guess the title of the video suggests, in this particular experiment, researchers were able to prove Einstein incorrect. And yet the title was basically clickbait, but honestly it's kind of true. And so let's discuss this experiment and what it means in a bit more detail. But first, let's briefly discuss the double-slit experiment, in case you're not sure what it's all about. And this is a really old experiment. The original experiment was conducted by British scientist Thomas Young in 1801, so 225 years ago from when I'm making this video. But the original design was to prove that light behaves like a wave. And in this experiment, a beam of light, or in more modern versions, a beam of electrons, or really any other particle, is directed at a barrier with two narrow slits. And on the other side of the barrier there's a screen that detects the location where particles arrive. And so if particles behave like tiny balls, you would expect two lines on the detector, essentially corresponding to two open slits. But when using lasers or when using light, instead we get a pattern containing bright and dark fringes, referred to as interference pattern. You can see it appearing in this particular video, showing us the electron buildup in the classical double-slit experiment. And so in essence it would resemble something like this, or even something like this, with this pattern arising because each particle behaves like a wave passing through both slits simultaneously. And those waves interfere with each other, reinforcing in some places, which produces bright fringes, or cancelling, which produces dark fringes. And remarkably, this interference pattern remains even when particles are fired one at a time, suggesting that each particle somehow interferes with itself and not just other particles, with this experiment fundamentally showing us that observing which slit the particle passes through can change the outcome, or it can basically collapse the wave-like behavior into particle-like behavior. And this is the core principle of quantum mechanics, and of course led to the concept of wave-particle duality, the fundamental principle that suggests that all particles have both particle and wave properties. And so here, just to summarize the main discoveries, these two slits will produce an interference pattern and not just two bands, and this pattern results from the wave interference of particle waves. But by measuring which slit the particle passes through, we'll actually destroy interference and make particles behave like particles. And this experiment has been tested with a lot of stuff: photons, electrons, and even larger particles like actual molecules. And so for decades, this experiment has been the cornerstone of quantum physics, demonstrating that light, and indeed all matter, behaves like both particles and waves. But it also presented us with that paradox. The paradox that you can never observe both properties at the same time. And so, for example, if you try to see the path of a photon, its wave-like interference seems to vanish. And it was actually in the 20th century that this bizarre phenomenon was discovered. The strange disappearance of the interference pattern was really only observed in the early 1900s. And by itself, this was a bit perplexing. Why would light act like a wave when unobserved, but become a particle when suddenly we measure its path? And so for some reason, the act of observation fundamentally changes the reality of what's being observed. And naturally, this created a lot of different propositions in the early 1900s, with the most famous friendly debate being between two titans of physics, Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr. And in 1927, Einstein proposed another one of his famous thought experiments. This was referred to as the Gedanken experiment, trying to catch light in the act of being both a wave and a particle simultaneously. And here Einstein argued that if a photon passes through one of two slits, it would most likely impart a tiny force, or I guess a tiny influence, on the slit itself. And Einstein believed that by detecting this subtle force, it might be possible to calculate photon's path or its particle nature, while still observing the interference pattern representing the wave nature. In other words, he proposed that it should be possible to observe both particle properties and wave properties. But this was against Niels Bohr's propositions. This was against quantum physics. Quantum mechanical models were all based on the uncertainty principle. And Bohr demonstrated that if you gained enough information to determine the path of the photon, the very act of obtaining this information would inevitably wash out any interference pattern. In other words, you cannot observe the light and expect it to show you all of its properties. And since then, most of the quantum experiments so far have shown this to be more or less correct. But this new experiment from the scientists at MIT were finally able to definitively show this using an idealized setup. You can find the study by Wolfgang Ketterle and a team from the MIT in the description below. But here, instead of using traditional slits, they actually used individual ultra-cold atoms, with each of them acting as a kind of a slit. Or essentially, each of these individual atoms would be scattering photons coming from various lasers. And the experiment involved preparing a sample of 10,000 ultra-cold atoms using lithium-7 and dysprosium-162. Here they relied on what's known as Mott insulating slate with an optical lattice that allowed them to arrange the atoms with an even spacing and essentially crystal-like configuration, with every single atom having identical isolation and distance. And the atoms were also cooled down to microkelvin in temperature, just a little bit hotter than absolute zero. And then came the lasers. But here they had to use an extremely weak beam of light in order not to disturb the structure. And the point was for each of these atoms to at most scatter just one photon. And this would produce what's known as Rayleigh scattering, or the simplest possible situation involving an atomic two-level system, or the simplest possible situation involving atoms and a little bit of excitation. And the goal was pretty simple. They wanted to observe how a single photon scatters off two adjacent atoms, simulating the light passing through two slits. But they wanted to observe two different phenomena: coherent and incoherent light scattering. Or just to simplify this, here the scientists could adjust the quantum fuzziness of the atom and change the uncertainty in their position. And so essentially here the scientists could control the wave-like or the particle-like behavior of various photons. And this was done by holding these atoms by shining lasers at them, which would then act like a spring. And so by tuning this laser, they could either loosen or tighten the atom's confinement, changing the fuzziness of individual atoms, which essentially allowed them to control the photon's path and also provided them with information about each individual photon. And so this atomic fuzziness, or in more scientific terms, spatial delocalization of wave packets, contributed to how different photons would be scattered. And so when the scientists increased the atomic positional uncertainty, they observed that the photons behaved like waves. But when the atoms were precisely localized, photons started to act like particles, with scientists confirming that the scattering intensity was exactly the same in both scenarios. Or confirming that these springs don't seem to matter, thus suggesting that Einstein's explanation was incorrect. And this observation perfectly matches all of the quantum theory predictions, providing the necessary validation for Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and suggesting that it's impossible to measure two properties at the same time. And so here, when we measure photons interacting with atoms, in order to, for example, discover their path, the fundamental uncertainty between position and momentum seems to create some kind of a trade-off. And the more precision you expect, the more we disturb the momentum, which seems to collapse the wave-like interference. With this experiment definitively confirming that this is not just some kind of a limitation of measurements, but seems to be an intrinsic quantum property. And this was determined by seeing that all of the light scattered between atoms was only partially coherent, and this partial coherence seemed to depend on the entanglement between light and the atomic motion. Or just to once again simplify all of this, here the team from MIT showed that these ultra-cold atoms acting as slits were not producing any spring effects in order to affect the light's wave-particle duality. And what truly mattered in this particular experiment was the fuzziness of the atom itself, or basically how certain or uncertain its location seems to be. And so if the atom is much fuzzier, it's a lot more likely to interact with the photon, providing us some information about the path of the photon. And because in this case researchers used 10,000 atoms in order to increase the chance for this slit-like interaction, here the signals were quite easily detected, and the results were pretty substantial. And so this was definitely a really intriguing representation of the classical double-slit experiment, confirming fundamental principles of quantum mechanics. But the experiment itself is also important for scientists studying quantum mechanics, because here by using these single atom wave packets and optical lattices, it potentially opens up new avenues for a lot of similar experiments and investigations, with scientists behind this particular study already planning a new experiment using even more complexity. For example, using atoms in superposition states, or using two-atom wave packets that can potentially present us with new interactions between atoms, allowing researchers to study scattering effects on phenomena like coherence. And so here the MIT team did not just reconfirm something we already knew, but to some extent showed us something even deeper. They showed us why light behaves the way it does by using a completely new setup and a new elegant experiment that will most likely lead to new discoveries in quantum physics. But I guess for now at least, that's all I wanted to mention. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss a somewhat intriguing and somewhat unusual experiment. An experiment involving mice that were genetically modified to have one single gene to be exactly the same as the one inside humans. And this produced results scientists are still trying to understand. And here this gene that generates a protein known as NOVA1 may potentially explain why humans can communicate the way we communicate, and might have created our ability to produce complex ideas and to verbalize a lot of our thoughts. And so let's talk about this somewhat unusual but somewhat exciting experiment in a little bit more detail and talk about some of the potential ramifications. Now, as always, you can find the study itself in the description below, and here the study by Yoko Tajima basically focused on a somewhat unknown protein known as NOVA1. It's a protein that binds to RNA molecules encoded by the NOVA1 gene, and in essence sort of looks like this. And though like many other genes and many other proteins, it seems to be responsible for a lot of different functions, inside the brain it seems to be responsible for neural development. As a matter of fact, all of the previous studies about this gene were mostly studying this gene because it seems to be associated with a lot of different brain disorders, specifically when it has some kind of a problem. But by itself, this NOVA1 gene is also known as master gene regulator. You can essentially think of it as a kind of a master switch, and so any problem with the NOVA gene results in some serious issues. You can actually learn about this gene and its functions from one of the studies from 2014 that you can find in the description. But surprisingly, it does seem to affect at least 90% of all human genes in some way or another. But most of the interest in the last few years was really in regards to its effects on the brain, because scientists discovered that when it creates this nova-1 protein, this can then rearrange sections of RNA inside neurons, making them form in a very different way, making them create certain structures and develop in certain ways. Here's another study from just 2 years ago that essentially discovers that it seems to regulate very specific activity inside hypothalamus, with any change to this protein affecting our brain and hypothalamus in somewhat serious ways. And so the overall conclusion from many of these studies is basically that this unusual gene changes how our brain cells seem to synthesize proteins, and thus changes how our neurons develop. And one of the main conclusions here is that it seems to dramatically increase molecular diversity inside neurons. And naturally, because this gene is so important, it does not just exist in humans. As a matter of fact, it looks like most mammals, or possibly even all mammals, seem to contain nova-1 inside their genes. And obviously, because this is a master gene, this should not come as a surprise. It would explain why so many mammals develop in very similar ways, and even have somewhat similar brain structures. Except that there's a very small side note here. Of all of the mammals in nature, it looks like human nova-1 gene has one tiny difference. It literally has a single amino acid that's different in human version compared to other mammals. Here, inside the position 197, the isoleucine amino acid has now been changed to valine, which, though might not be a big deal, completely changes the protein in humans compared to other mammals, at least in terms of its structure. And because of this bizarre difference, for many years now, some researchers speculated that maybe this is actually something that makes us very different, and specifically, maybe this is something that gave us speech. So for the past few years, nova-1 has actually been the so-called language gene contender, because only humans seem to have this specific form. But this was somewhat debatable because previously, in a lot of different studies, a slightly different gene was a better contender. A gene you see right here known as FOXP2, or fork hat box protein P2. A gene expressed inside the brain, the heart, the lungs, and the digestive system that also exists in a lot of different vertebrates. And intriguingly, one of the experiments back in the days revealed that when this gene is introduced into mice, they actually start to speak differently, or technically squeak differently. This was reported back in 2009, and here the human version of this gene made the mice produce slightly different sounds. Although here it also produced some additional bizarre behaviors. For example, the mice were not as curious anymore, and did not feel as much joy because for some reason their brain was not producing as much dopamine. Nevertheless, this experiment and this study was actually exciting just because this was achieved, and because it was now possible to test other genes just to see if we can discover this language gene and communication gene that in essence makes us human. Although when it comes to this FOXP2 gene, based on the analysis of Neanderthals and Denisovans, or essentially our cousins from back in the days, they also seem to have this gene as well, and it was very similar to the one in humans, which back in the days implied that maybe Neanderthals could also speak like humans. And one of the reasons scientists actually thought that FOXP2 was a language gene was because of the disorders associated with the problems inside this gene. Anyone that has a mutation in this gene very often has a lot of speech defects and is unable to move their lips and their mouth in order to produce any speech. Likewise, compared to other mammals, the human FOXP2 gene is just a little bit different, but is exactly the same as the one inside Neanderthals. And so this was thought to be the origin of human language. But naturally, this was just the beginning, and obviously scientists wanted to keep looking just to see if we can find other contenders or discover something else. And so 16 years later, we get a new study. A very similar experiment, but an even more exciting discovery. Because in this case, this nova-1 gene is definitely unique to humans. Neanderthals and Denisovans did not have the same gene either, and it seems to be one of the few genes that pretty much all humans contain. Now here I'm saying almost because there is a very bizarre discovery. Researchers were able to collect anonymous DNA sequences from approximately 650,000 humans and discover this gene in almost everybody except for 6 people. Now because these were anonymous, we have no idea who they are, but for some reason out of 650,000 people, 6 contained a different variant. Obviously there's no explanation why and why they have this mutation, but it would be interesting to find out if this produced any kind of a problem with their speech. But based on the genetic analysis, we know that this gene is relatively new in terms of evolutionary times. Since Neanderthals and Denisovans did not have this gene, it must have evolved after the species split. And based on a thorough genetic analysis, scientists believe that it must have formed only a few 100,000 years ago, possibly even less. And so because of the novelty of this gene, it was obviously somewhat intriguing to discover what effect this has on humans and what effect it might have on these mice. And that's because mice, despite containing a similar gene, do not contain the same gene. This is really uniquely human. And to test this, scientists created genetic mutations that made these genes exactly the same as human genes, and then conducted two separate experiments, one involving pups and one involving grown-up mice. And even as pups, these mice were already doing something different. Compared to a regular pup, these genetically modified pups were producing frequencies that were much higher. Basically ultrasonic squeaks, but in much higher frequencies than usual. And for some unknown reasons, despite a lot of screaming, their moms seem to ignore them. Normally, when pups produce ultrasound squeaks, their moms come right away. But here, even at young age, these pups were already producing different sounds and thus communicating a little bit differently. But a much more intriguing discovery came from the mice that were already older. So basically, once these pups grew up and became older, they then went on their first date, or technically had their first courting experience. And surprisingly here, during courtship, these genetically modified mice were producing calls that were very different from a regular mouse. And though the frequency was exactly the same, the actual amount of squeaks was extremely different and much more complex. In other words, they were actually making sounds that were way more complex in terms of syllables, with the overall communication being longer and more diverse. In other words, I guess in human terms, their pickup lines were very elaborate.
Oh, no, go! I've scared you. I've said too much. I'm hopeless and awkward and desperate for love.
And this is a really bizarre discovery. It really confirms that the mutation in this Nova1 gene is potentially responsible for our ability to communicate with so much complexity and our ability to express so many complex thoughts in so many different ways. And because here this gene could also be tracked inside the brain of the mouse, it definitively confirmed dramatic changes in a lot of different sections, especially the ones responsible for communication. And this was a direct and definitive confirmation that Nova1 protein seems to dramatically change vocalization patterns and may indeed be the human language gene, a human-specific gene that literally built our culture. And these bizarre vocalization patterns that were detected in these mice, though preliminary, still seems to suggest that even in these mice the communication became way more complex and much more elaborate. But unfortunately it seems to have failed to impress other mice. In other words, just having this one mutation would obviously not suddenly turn them human. And since the brain analysis confirms that there is a change in the vocal behavior area, right now there is little to doubt that Nova1 was indeed responsible. But in humans, it obviously does so many other things. For example, we know that it also affects learning. And problems with Nova1 have been correlated with various learning disabilities. And that's on top of approximately 90 other things it seems to be responsible for. And so basically here, it might not be just a language gene, it might be a gene responsible for a lot of other things that make us human. And something that very likely evolved in early humans and eventually became dominant because it very likely provided a lot of advantage. Advantage in communication, but also possibly things like learning and even understanding the environment. Okay, let's discuss the strange creature behind me and what's basically one of the biggest stories in marine biology in the last few decades. The first ever video of an actual colossal squid swimming underwater. The video filmed by the Schmidt Ocean Institute and the Ocean Census Partner during one of the expeditions in the South Atlantic. And just like with a lot of previous expeditions, this was basically a completely unexpected discovery. But in this case also an extremely rare discovery that's never been seen before by anyone. Because this is a really bizarre creature and is just really good at avoiding us. And so the video itself is obviously in the description below, but today I wanted to briefly discuss the colossal squids and why they're so bizarre, and also why this video is kind of fascinating. But first, what exactly are we looking at here? Well, this is actually just a baby, and it's a baby that's going to look entirely different in the next few years. Because as you're going to learn from this video, this somewhat unusual species tends to change dramatically as it grows up. And it's called colossal squid for a single reason. It is basically the largest invertebrate on the planet, an animal that can grow up to about 7 meters in length and weigh as much as 500 kilograms. And though there have been hints of even larger specimen, right now this is what's been confirmed so far. And we know that larger specimens exist because of this. This is a beak of a colossal squid, and this is how we knew these animals existed as far back as 1925. You can actually find the original link for the 1924-1925 discovery in the description below, but here this was a description of the first ever specimen that was discovered inside the stomach of a sperm whale that was commercially hunted a few months prior. So basically we know that sperm whales generally seem to like eating colossal squids. And over the years these beaks were discovered in a lot of different sources, actually even in seabirds, allowing researchers to eventually work out the overall size distribution for this somewhat bizarre species. As a matter of fact, based on the discovery from 1925, it's believed that this particular specimen was 46 feet or 14 meters long and at least 1100 pounds or 500 kilograms in weight. Way bigger than any invertebrate ever known, and actually even bigger than the famous giant squid. And by the way, yeah, don't confuse this with a giant squid, which is a slightly different animal. But ever since the original discovery of these beaks, it was really the reports from various fishermen that allowed us to basically understand a little bit more about this somewhat strange, somewhat elusive species. For example, one of the most famous discoveries prior to this was in 2007. This was the largest colossal squid discovered in one piece. Here this was a female, approximately 10 meters across and 450 kilograms in weight. And it was basically almost dead. And eventually the specimen was taken to New Zealand and preserved in a museum. But interestingly, this looks very different from this. And there's a really important reason for that, as we're going to discuss right now. So as I mentioned, this is still a baby, only approximately 30 centimeters across. And compared to the larger specimen, one thing here that stands out is its somewhat bizarre cupola. It's actually transparent. As a matter of fact, it's not just the cupola, it's also a lot of its organs and even its eyes, which is not the case for the larger specimen discovered here. And that's because colossal squids belong to a somewhat bizarre squid family. They're known as Crunchidae, or more commonly, glass squid. And the reason they're called glass squid is because all of them have transparent bodies, and they use this as a major adaptation and as a major survival strategy. But most glass squids, or most cranchids, usually occur in surface or mid-water depths in various open oceans, with the transparency in this case offering camouflage. As a matter of fact, their body shape and even cells inside their skin are basically designed for maximum camouflage in order to hide from, for example, larger fish, from whales, or from a lot of other predators. And in marine biology, they're basically known as the masters of deep-sea camouflage. They're extremely difficult to detect, and some of them even have bizarre light-producing organs that actually mimic illumination from above the squid and from below the squid to basically make them almost entirely invisible. And so yeah, this is like something out of science fiction, like basically the alien from Predator. As a matter of fact, for many of them, only some organs are still visible. Interestingly, for many of them, it's their digestive organs. Specifically, the digestive gland, which is very similar to our liver. But even here, they actually created a bizarre adaptation. Instead of being horizontal like in other squids, here it's vertical in order to make it as invisible as possible, and in order to reduce the overall silhouette. And on top of this, compared to other squids, they also have a very bizarre adaptation when it comes to buoyancy. This is the only known animal that seems to use a very unusual solution of ammonia in order to control its overall buoyancy and in order to stay afloat at different depths. And so here, by consolidating ammonia in certain regions of their body, they can usually minimize energy costs required for buoyancy. But strangely enough, this organ and this ability to control buoyancy is actually something that's only developed in mature individuals and not in babies, which could be one of the main reasons why we usually find much smaller and much younger squid near the surface, and the older individuals are only seen really deep. So basically, as they grow up and as they develop, they learn how to control buoyancy much better and can thus stay at much deeper depths. But also, unlike other squid, glass squid also dramatically changes its body shape as it grows. As a matter of fact, in many species, the young do not look like mature individuals at all, and so for many years there was actually a lot of misidentification, with certain species that were believed to be different actually turning out to be the same. It's just some of them were older and some of them were younger. But I think the most important difference here is really the overall adaptation to light sensitivity and to the overall lifestyle. Unlike other squid, glass squid is actually super difficult to find, and they're really good at avoiding everyone. These animals are not just difficult to find, they're also extremely good at detecting anything that's coming toward them in order to then avoid it and to hide from it actively. So basically these are light-avoiding animals. They're extremely sensitive to even minute changes in light signals, even at extreme depths where there's practically no light. And they actually do this in a lot of different ways, with the most common way being the ability to detect minute changes in photoluminescence coming from a lot of different plankton in the water. So basically, let's say there's some kind of a whale coming toward them. Because the whale moves water quite violently, it actually produces minute changes in light as a result of physical activity. This is the result of a lot of phytoplankton releasing light as something touches it or as something physically interacts with it. And so many of these glass squid can easily detect the light from hundreds of meters away when there's something coming toward them. So they basically developed a technique in detecting bioluminescence from extreme distances, and this is why many of them have humongous eyes. But the record goes to this guy. This is not just the biggest squid eye, this is the biggest eye in the animal kingdom. Their eyes can be as big as 11 inches or 27 centimeters across, or basically the size of a soccer ball. And they're designed specifically for detection of this very minute change in bioluminescence at extreme depths. And so whenever there's a whale coming toward them and it produces changes in bioluminescence, all specimens of glass squid try to escape while also trying to make themselves appear as invisible as possible. Which is kind of what was happening here as well, because this squid did not want to get caught. And this is also the main reason why we basically have so much trouble finding them, because they're generally very good at detecting something and running away from it. But as I mentioned before, something actually changes as they grow up. As a matter of fact, as they grow older and older, they tend to go deeper and deeper in the water, their transparency and their skills to become invisible kind of disappear, and they slowly transform into, basically, a slightly different animal, or at least dramatically change their lifestyle, as they essentially now become one of the apex predators. Although even as grown-ups, they still use a lot of techniques that rely on being super quiet and practically invisible. And that's because they're technically ambush predators. They quietly wait for the prey to get really close and then try to grab it with these enormous hooks before trying to kill it with this beak. Which, by the way, is also one of the main differences between the colossal squid and the other members of the glass squid family. It seems to be the only species to possess these enormous hooks that it basically uses to catch various types of prey. And even this young one right here seems to possess them as well, suggesting that even as juveniles, they seem to already possess a lot of skills required to be an ambush predator. But nevertheless, this is still a bit of an anomaly when it comes to the family of glass squid. I mean, just the fact that they lose their transparency and even change their bodies so much that they become hunters and start to actively hunt prey already makes them so different from anything else. And from what we can tell, despite the fact that we don't see them very often, they seem to be super successful. And this is based on the fact that we discover a lot of beaks in a lot of different whales, and even the fact that a lot of fish that's caught coming from the deep ocean very often contains a lot of scars from the battle with the colossal squid. So basically, in many cases, fish tends to run away, but is still left scarred. Statistically, out of about 800 fish that was examined, 10% contain scars from the colossal squid. And so once they become adults and once they become large enough, they basically never come to the surface ever again. They can easily survive very deep in the ocean and only have to feed once in a while. As a matter of fact, they seem to possess an extremely slow metabolic rate and only require something like 30 grams of prey every single day. So basically they just have to eat once every few months. Which also implies that its overall lifestyle is very likely super slow. It just kind of drifts around, using its eyes to observe everything around itself, and then slowly tries to approach its prey, ambushing it, and capturing the prey with its hooks. And because its eyes can detect even minute changes in plankton bioluminescence, it's basically able to see everything around itself, even super deep in the ocean. Here, studies have previously shown that it's able to see up to about 150 meters away from the squid through the observations of these changes invisible to other species. And its eyes can also surprisingly glow in the dark. They actually have their own cells inside that create just a little bit of light, which seem to use a very specific symbiotic bacteria able to produce luminescence through chemical reactions. This is very likely used at super extreme depths when there's basically no light anywhere, so it can produce its own light just to see a little bit. Although in reality, right now nobody knows why this adaptation exists. This study by Peter Herring and his team explores this in more detail in the Journal of Zoology. But naturally, it also has its own predators as well, such as sperm whales I mentioned previously. And we know that sperm whales evolved to use something that the squid can basically not detect. Sperm whales use very high frequency clicks, with other whales using sonar, which unfortunately these squids cannot hear at all. They can usually hear much lower frequencies, such as the ones produced by various fish, and so the only way they can detect predators, such as whales, is by using their eyes. Intriguingly enough though, the overall threshold of detection when it comes to light is actually surprisingly similar to the threshold of the acoustic sonar produced by the whale. And so here this is actually a super interesting example of coevolutionary adaptation between the prey and the predator. It's quite likely that the vision and the sonar co-evolved, representing a kind of an evolutionary battle. But unfortunately, that's basically all we know about these really bizarre and very fascinating animals. So this is kind of strange, but the last video I made about Planet 9 was actually exactly 1 year ago. And that's because back in May of 2024, we've discussed one of the most recent studies that seems to have discovered even more hints for why Planet 9 might be real after all. This was new, strong evidence based on orbits of various trans-Neptunian objects that basically hinted that even though this planet isn't visible right now, it's still somewhere out there. And well, hello info person, this is Anton. Today we're going to discuss a relatively new study that was just released a year later that potentially discovers one of the possible candidates, and maybe even the best candidate, that was finally identified in a study using infrared data from older telescopes. And so let's discuss this recent discovery that could be groundbreaking if it's true, but also talk about some of the previous discoveries in the last few months. But first, super brief history of Planet 9 and why we think it exists. Here the story starts in 2016. Two astronomers from Caltech presented evidence that some of the distant objects orbiting past Neptune seemed to bunch together in a somewhat unusual way, suggesting something was pulling them and changing their orbit. And they were actually far enough from Neptune for this not to be Neptune, which basically became this hypothesis referred to as Planet 9. And over time, there's been a lot of different discoveries and a lot of different hints of its existence, including observations from other star systems that actually contained somewhat similar objects. Here's actually one example from HD 106906. And so if this planet was real, it could actually explain a lot of things about the solar system, including various tilted orbits of different objects that orbit past Neptune, while also explaining certain other orbits that make no sense otherwise. For example, objects orbiting in the opposite direction of everything else that would be somewhat difficult to explain unless something affected them gravitationally. Likewise, if this planet was real, it would finally present us with a type of a planet that we're actually missing. Because here, the solar system, compared to a lot of other systems containing exoplanets, does not contain any mini-Neptunes, does not contain super-Earths, despite containing planets like Jupiter and Saturn, and mini-Neptunes and super-Earths are actually the most common planets in the entire galaxy. Yet somehow the solar system has none. But the proposed mass and size for Planet 9 would actually technically make it either a mini-Neptune or a super-Earth, thus making the solar system just another star system out there. And so in the last few months there's been quite a few additional studies trying to discover this planet somewhere out there or trying to refine its potential orbit. For example, one of the most recent studies was a targeted search for Planet 9 based on the assumption that certain asteroids and certain meteoroids might have actually been influenced by Planet 9, and so we can actually use their orbit to potentially determine where it is. Like before, the study finds nothing. Then we had the additional very extensive survey by the original authors that tried to look for Planet 9 using a very large survey of various stars, and nothing discovered here either. Basically none of the objects in the survey appear to be similar to the expected Planet 9. And though some additional recent studies tried to rework its orbit and even its potential mass and size, we still don't seem to find anything anywhere. With some studies even suggesting that maybe it actually left the solar system a long time ago. Basically, it did influence certain objects, such as for example Sedna, and then got kicked out or captured by another star. We've discussed this proposition in one of the videos in the description, with some of the biggest studies actually suggesting that maybe this is all just a type of a selection bias, basically based on the way that we actually observe objects and based on the way that certain telescopes see things. Here, it does actually appear like something is pulling on these orbits, but in reality this is just based on the selection of these objects, and if you actually collect more data, this entire idea of a planet pulling on something kind of disappears. And this was actually a pretty big study from a few years back that we also discussed in one of the previous videos. And so in reality, even after I guess 9 years now, we still have no idea if this planet is real, if it really exists somewhere out there, or if its effects are actually effects or just basically bias. But now we have this new study by Terry Longfang and the team you see right here that makes this somewhat unusual and somewhat unexpected new discovery. And a discovery based on observations from much older telescopes, infrared telescopes that conducted full sky surveys back in the days. And so here's what researchers did in this study and what they actually discovered. First, they used the data from IRAS, Infrared Astronomical Satellite, launched back in 1983. And this was the first ever infrared telescope, sort of like the grandfather of the James Webb. This was a very successful mission, and it only lasted for about 10 months, but it was able to create an extremely beautiful image of the entire night skies in the infrared, while also discovering tons and tons of different objects. And this was also the start of the infrared astronomy as a kind of a separate field. But then, a few decades later, Japan launched their own version. This is a telescope known as Akari. This was a collaboration between Japan, Europe, and South Korea, and it was a much more powerful infrared telescope that collected data between 2006 and 2011 when it suddenly broke down. But before it broke down, it was able to do something very similar. An all-night sky infrared image with tons and tons of new objects. But because there were approximately 23 years between these two missions and between these two infrared maps, it actually presented astronomers with a really intriguing technique. You could now compare these two night skies and discover certain differences that could be caused by slow-moving objects. In other words, by comparing these two images, it actually became possible to detect certain objects that were moving super slow, which is exactly what's expected of Planet 9 as well. We do expect it to move very slowly across the night skies, with its orbit potentially taking thousands of years. And so in this study, researchers did just that. They basically took two maps separated by 23 years and tried to find every single candidate that moved just a little bit across the night skies. Specifically moved from the IRAS position to Akari position, but not enough to be a distant star, and also way less than a typical comet or an asteroid. Likewise, because these observations in the infrared, researchers were actually looking at natural emissions from the object, meaning that this object had to be glowing and had to have certain mass. And turns out that initially they found 13 different candidates. But eventually this was narrowed down to just one, the candidate that you see right here, and the candidate that was detected by both telescopes and moved just a little bit, as predicted by different models. And so the question is this actually Planet 9? Well, unfortunately, we don't know, and it's going to be extremely difficult to tell exactly what this is, and here's why. In order to determine if this is Planet 9, we have to know the orbit of this object very well. But here we only have 2 points. With 2 points, it's almost impossible to determine the exact orbit, and it will take years and years of additional observations to find out where this object is actually going. Likewise, we also have to understand exactly what we're looking at here and why we're even seeing this. Here the assumption was that this object was about 500 to 700 times the distance of Earth to the Sun, or basically 500 AU in distance. And the mass was assumed to be 7 to maybe 17 masses of planet Earth, making it somewhat similar to Neptune. But previous predictions, including some of the most recent predictions, suggested that the mass here must be at least 3 times less, maybe 3 to 5 Earths, and not more than that. So we already have our first discrepancy. On top of this, some of the previous studies actually did not detect anything in these surveys, even using similar telescopes. And so the only reason this object was detected by the researchers from this study is really because they assumed that the planet here would be more massive than Neptune, or at least produce more emissions than Neptune, suggesting that it would be just a little bit hotter. Because anything less than 10 Earth masses would not actually produce enough flux or enough emissions to be visible to these telescopes at these extreme distances. This was one of the conclusions from the study as well, with researchers basically highlighting that whatever this is seems to be pretty massive. And so just to summarize, right now nobody actually knows exactly what this is. it could be Planet 9, but it could also be an entirely new object we never knew existed, possibly representing some kind of a massive object somewhere out there. And though it could be a planet in the solar system, at the same time, it could also be some kind of a rogue planet somewhere much farther away with a much higher mass, but basically moving across the night skies pretty fast. And so here, we don't really know if this is a close object moving slow or far object moving really fast, or if this is an object at all. For all we know, maybe this is also some kind of a statistical anomaly or some kind of a data artifact that only future analysis and future studies can determine. Either way though, this is definitely a super exciting new discovery. Assuming that this is a real object, it's definitely something that now has to be observed by other telescopes, including maybe the James Webb, because the James Webb will definitely see this very well since this is all in the infrared. On top of this, some of the instruments used for the optical telescopes, like the ones used in the dark energy survey known as DESI, are sensitive enough to maybe not just see this object, but even determine its exact orbit, because some of the older data might have already captured its motion, helping us figure out how it's moving. Which means that maybe in the next few months, we'll actually know exactly what this is, how it's moving, where it's orbiting, and, of course, if this is indeed Planet 9. Right now this is just a candidate, and a very intriguing candidate, but just like with the previous candidate from a few years back, it could be a nothing burger. But despite of this, all of these searches for Planet 9 have actually been super productive in discovering so many other objects. We've actually discussed different types of objects discovered in the solar system, and even different types of dark objects discovered in the galaxy that were found by accident while looking for Planet 9. So in that sense, we should not stop looking, because astronomers keep finding so many new things nobody knew existed. Hello info person, this is Anton, and in this video we're going to discuss a somewhat intriguing discovery, or I guess technically a somewhat intriguing creation, coming out of a Chinese university where researchers were able to create infrared lenses, or technically something that allows humans to perceive infrared light as if it was optical emissions, even allowing humans to perceive different colors. And though obviously seeing infrared with, for example, infrared cameras is already achievable, in this case the main achievement is that we basically require absolutely no cameras, no batteries, nothing. You just take a contact lens, put it in your eye, and you're suddenly able to see infrared. And so let's talk about this study in a little bit more detail, starting with the study itself. A study by Yu-Chan Ma and the team you see right here from the University of Science and Technology of China. And so what exactly was this for? And I guess, why did the scientists try to create this to begin with? Well, the main idea here is to remove the limitations of mammalian vision. Because when it comes to light perception, most mammals still have a very limited perception when it comes to different wavelengths. Pretty much most mammals can only perceive a relatively small fraction of the visible light, mostly between 400 and 700 nanometers in wavelengths. But over half of solar radiation is also in the infrared emissions, and specifically over 700 nanometers in wavelength, that's completely imperceptible to most complex life. And though some animals are able to see it to some extent, none of the mammals can. Now obviously we can sense it with our skin, because that's basically just heat, but when it comes to our eyes, there's definitely a major limitation. Yet we know that other animals, like for example reptiles and especially snakes, seem to be able to perceive infrared because it obviously helps them detect animals at night. All warm-blooded animals emit a lot of infrared radiation, basically making all warm-blooded animals light up in the infrared. But in case of mammalian eyes, because of the properties of opsins, or the photodetecting cells inside our eyes, it's just impossible by nature. And so as a result, we always kind of relied on additional technology. For example, night vision goggles or infrared goggles that are able to actively convert infrared emissions into something that's more visible. But in the past, researchers actually experimented with mice to try to do something a little bit different. They tried to give mice natural infrared perception by modifying their retina. And in this case, this was achieved by injecting the retina of mice with very specific nanoparticles containing a bunch of rare metals, such as for example ytterbium and erbium, that naturally diffract the light in such a way that it changes wavelengths. But although this is possible in mice, this is naturally not so easy for humans, mostly because not everyone is going to be okay injecting their eyes with some kind of a nanoparticle. And so as a result, for the past 5 to 6 years, the same team tried to figure out if they can actually turn this into a contact lens, specifically by building a very small polymer that can then be injected into a typical lens and then provide infrared vision by just inserting it into your eye. Which is exactly what they were doing for the past few years, and which is exactly what this whole study is about, because they finally succeeded. By using very similar nanoparticles containing ytterbium and erbium, and by combining this with a bunch of polymers to create soft lenses, they were able to create the first successful prototype. But the first one was actually for mice, not for humans. Mostly because it was not clear if it's going to be safe. And here these contact lenses were specifically designed by integrating upconversion nanoparticles, also known as UCNPs, into very soft, non-invasive and wearable polymeric materials, very similar to what we usually have inside a contact lens. But the material had to have a very specific refractive index in order to work correctly with the infrared light. And so the main challenge in this case was to try to pack enough of these nanoparticles in order to convert sufficient infrared light without altering the lenses and without making them too opaque, or basically in order to maintain their transparency. And well, eventually, after a lot of trial and error, looks like they succeeded. They found the right composition and the right density to create something with a correct refractive index that would then, in theory, convert infrared into optical emissions. But what's even more impressive in this case is that they were able to design it in such a way that they were able to convert 3 separate wavelengths of infrared into 3 separate wavelengths of optical light corresponding to different colors. Or just to rephrase this, they were able to convert infrared light into color vision. Something that's never really been achieved with anything before, and something that's even difficult with a typical infrared camera. But once this was created, it now had to be tested. And as always, the first test was with mice. And here right away, mice could sense the visible light and easily distinguish near-infrared information, even though other mice without the lenses could not perceive anything. And so here, by performing several experiments by using the infrared light and regular light, researchers definitively established that mice could now perceive all of the infrared emissions. But here, a much more important test was the test of safety. Was this actually safe? Because here the main goal was to create a polymeric nanocomposite that was suitable for human eyes. And while all of the tests in mice suggested that there was no risk for cornea or for any eye damage, and there was no inflammation reported in any of the groups, which meant that the next test had to be done in humans. Now here I could not actually find any information on who they used, but this could be just the result of the privacy clause in most studies. Either way, by synthesizing the same nanoparticles and by creating the same lenses, they now try to do the same with human participants. And just like with mice, humans could now perceive infrared emissions coming from a very small infrared light. For example, in most cases, any kind of infrared blinking, like the Morse code, was instantly seen by a person wearing the lenses and was not seen by anyone without them. Moreover, humans were also able to see a kind of like trichromatic infrared light, basically visible as 3 separate colors: blue, red, and green. And so here the infrared light was directly converted into 3 primary colors visible by the participants. And to be more exact, the wavelength of 800 to 1600 nanometers in range was now converted to green, red, and blue, which was basically a definitive proof that it's possible for humans to perceive infrared emissions without any invasive procedures and without any equipment. But surprisingly, something else happened when these humans closed their eyes. With eyes closed, obviously nobody could see anything in the optical light. But turns out the infrared perception increased dramatically. And that's because the optical emissions were no longer visible, and so now only the infrared could be perceived by human eyes. And also because the eyelids are actually transparent to the infrared. And so as a result, with eyes closed, all of the near-infrared emissions became extremely visible. Something that was also previously seen in mice as well. Which by itself is, I guess, kind of cool, but the next question is, so is this useful at all, and are there any actual practical applications? Well, first of all, because in this case, this didn't seem to affect the normal vision at all. These lenses seem to function just like your typical contact lens. But in this case, it also provides additional near-infrared color vision, which means that there might be some use for situations where infrared emissions are the only way for us to see. So, for example, in poor visibility conditions, such as where there is a lot of fog, and by combining this with a lot of different smart devices, such as the ones emitting infrared, it might become possible for humans to navigate just by wearing these contact lenses. Now I guess one example here would be something like a pilot, for example, that can maybe see through fog as long as there are infrared emissions somewhere on the ground. Or maybe navigating in very dark conditions such as in collapsed mines or in caves where there's basically no other way to see. Likewise, maybe this could be used by doctors. For example, performing surgery without using any sensors, by directly seeing inside the body because the human body emits infrared. Or one of the propositions in the study suggests using this as a kind of a anti-counterfeit mark. Basically, by putting a mark that's only visible in the infrared, it might be possible to use this as some kind of an identification. But that's based on this study. Scientific critics, though, don't actually agree, with many pointing out that this is still an extremely early prototype and is unlikely to be useful at all. For example, first of all, currently these lenses cannot actually achieve fine image perception, mostly because of the optical principles used, and so basically everything here will just appear blurry. And that's because these nanoparticles scatter light in such a way that they can only create very blurry images. Right now, because of the optical principles, this is going to be very difficult to fix. And though it might be partially corrected by, for example, using glasses along with the lenses, all of this is still an extremely early prototype. Moreover, unlike typical night vision goggles, these lenses do not amplify light, and so they can technically only see intense infrared emissions, such as what they were actually able to observe in this experiment. Only relatively bright infrared emissions could be detected, and so something that's much dimmer, such as for example some kind of a sensor farther away, will actually still be invisible. And so once again, those pilots using the infrared contact lenses might actually still find this very difficult, because in natural conditions at night and without some kind of an infrared illumination, this technology might still not work. And so the critics of the study basically conclude that this is cool, it's definitely something creative, but might not be super useful, or at least more useful than just using typical infrared goggles. But in this case, this team plans to continue their work and wants to put even more nanoparticles into lenses in order to create even more efficient conversion and in order to increase sensitivity, with the other goal being making this even cheaper than it is right now. Currently, a pair of lenses like this would cost approximately $200 US, which though expensive, is definitely cheaper than your typical infrared goggles. But once this technique is perfected, they might be actually much cheaper, basically costing like $10 or so, for what could one day become some really intriguing, somewhat unusual way to perceive the world around us. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss a discovery of a very strange pulsating object that currently does not make sense, and according to the researchers, should not actually be possible or exist at all. And that's because based on the observations and the recent discovery, this new object known as ASCAP J1839-0756 seems to be producing a lot of pulsating emissions we've never seen before and that cannot be explained using modern physics. And so let's discuss this unusual object in a little bit more detail, but I guess let's start with the discovery first. And well, the first hint for the existence of this object was from the Australian radio telescope known as ASCAP, also known as Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder. This telescope is actually known for producing the biggest radio map of the night skies we've ever had, and we'll discuss this in one of the previous videos in the description. And so during its normal operations and normal observations, there was one unusual signal that kind of stood out because there was really nothing around it. Here this appeared to be as an extremely strong radio signal that was at first getting brighter, but then started to dim, with its brightness going down by about 95% in just 15 minutes. And this was already kind of unusual and actually has not been seen before. For example, instead of a typical fast radio burst, this was actually an extremely slow radio burst. And so it wasn't clear exactly what happened here or what produced this emission. Overall, the emission looked something like this, which meant that additional observations would have to be required in order to find out what's up here. And that's exactly what the scientists recently did, in the process uncovering a lot more emissions, especially when combining this with several other telescopes, including the famous Meerkat from South Africa. And this time, instead of a single emission, they actually discovered that this is a periodic emission that happens extremely slowly, with the new data suggesting that it takes approximately 6.5 hours between pulses. Or basically that this is indeed a pulsating radio object, but with an extremely long period we've never seen before. And this is basically where it kind of makes no sense. And I guess let me explain why. Normally, when it comes to pulsating radio sources, we usually detect them from various neutron stars. The most common one being a pulsar. And so typically what we actually see from pulsars is basically one of their beams pointed almost directly at us, with the periods corresponding to the wobble of the pulsar as it spins around its axis. And obviously in the last few decades, thousands and thousands of pulsars have been discovered pretty much everywhere, some of them spinning ridiculously fast, up to approximately 700 times per second, and you might actually want to check out one of the recent videos where another such pulsar potentially established a kind of a spinning limit when it comes to the maximum velocity. That video should be in the description below. And some pulsars spinning much slower. But to date, the record for the slowest spinning pulsar seems to be 23.5 seconds per rotation. This pulsar was discovered by the Chinese radio astronomers approximately 7 years ago. But in the last few years, researchers also started to discover unusual long-period radio pulsators, or radio transients as they're also known, which turn out to be some kind of a new class of objects where they basically still get to emit radio waves, but they're just doing so much slower. Here the period usually range between 18 minutes to maybe 54 minutes. So hundreds to thousands of times slower than a typical pulsar. And that actually did not make much sense, mostly because of how we think it works for a typical neutron star. In order for a pulsar to produce these radio pulsations, it has to actually spin pretty fast. And so in a typical pulsar, it's really the rotation of the magnetic field that has to happen really fast that produces these radio emissions. And that's because this magnetic field basically acts as a kind of a particle accelerator that accelerates various electrons that were produced as a result of gamma radiation coming from the neutron star interacting with the magnetic field around the pulsar. And so essentially through this rotational interaction of the magnetic field, a lot of these electrons are accelerated to very high velocities, which produces radio emissions in two separate directions following the magnetic field. But the object has to be spinning really fast for all of this to work. And so according to modern theories, it has to spin at least once per minute. Otherwise, it's actually going to stop producing radio waves because the magnetic field is just not going to be able to create any of this anymore. And so the previous detection of these long pulsators already produced a bit of a mystery. But here there might be one explanation. Maybe these are actually not pulsars but possibly magnetars, which could be producing these emissions in some other way through a different mechanism involving a much more powerful magnetic field. Or alternatively, these could be highly magnetized white dwarfs, which would be spinning much slower and may have similar magnetic properties, allowing them to pulsate in a similar way. But so far, individual white dwarfs have never actually been found to have these unusual pulsations, or at least that was the explanation for previous detections of these long-period oscillators detected in the last few years. And here we're talking about pulsations in minutes. But now we have a different story. Here, whatever is pulsating is doing so every 6.5 hours. And that's completely unexplainable. This would be the slowest pulsar ever discovered, and a pulsar where the mechanism cannot be explained using any technique. For example, can this be a magnetar? Well, pulsating magnetars have been discovered before, and actually with even slow pulsations, but all those pulsations were in the X-rays, not in radio light. Here's actually one of these examples, the magnetar 1E 161348-5055. That's technically a supernova remnant that produces periodic X-ray emissions every 6.6 hours. But here we see no X-rays, only radio light, which would make the magnetar explanation very challenging. Now, could this be some kind of a magnetized white dwarf? Well, usually white dwarfs produce other emissions as well, and in this case, no signs of white dwarfs have been seen so far, and no additional emissions or additional observations seem to be visible. Basically, no evidence for this being some kind of a white dwarf either. And so if not a magnetar, and if not a white dwarf, and if it cannot be a typical pulsar, what is this? What can possibly produce super strong radio emissions every 6.5 hours, yet produce no other emissions visible so far? And the answer is, I don't know, actually nobody does. This is basically a new, completely unexplainable, mysterious object. But what makes this object even more mysterious is the fact that even trying to model this or explain this physically just doesn't make sense. But we do have some hints based on what we know about pulsars and neutron stars. In other words, there's maybe a hint that this is a neutron star. And this is actually based on the orientation of the magnetic field compared to the rotational axis. So normally, in a typical pulsar, the rotational axis is just a little bit misaligned with the magnetic axis, which is actually one of the reasons pulsars can pulsate, beaming their light toward us. But in this case, for this pulsar, its magnetic axis seems to be almost at 90 degrees from the rotational axis, because during one of the observations, it was actually determined that it seems to produce a second flash after about 3.2 hours. This is known as the interpulse, and it's basically coming from the opposite direction, but it's not directly pointed at us, so it's much more difficult to see. And this apparently happens to approximately 3% of all pulsars we've seen so far, implying that this is maybe some kind of a really bizarre neutron star we've never seen before. But the problem is, of course, the fact that this spins so slow. All of the previous detections were spinning at least several times per second, and in every single case, over time as the pulsar slows down, we expect these radio emissions to stop completely. Nevertheless, there is still at least one hint right now that this is maybe a magnetically driven process from some kind of a very bizarre neutron star. Or, I guess, aliens. Well, maybe not aliens because the emissions here don't really seem to produce anything resembling artificial communication. Either way though, there is definitely a huge mystery now. The mystery of what exactly this is, how it works, or even how far away this object is from us. At this point, all of this is still unknown. Now, chances are if we actually discover similar objects somewhere out there, it will become much easier to explain them, but for now, many of these long-period pulsators discovered in the last 3 years don't really make a lot of sense. And though it was already difficult to explain pulsators with 50-minute periods, here we have to now explain one with 6.5-hour period. Which means that for the next few years, this is most likely going to be rewriting a lot of physics books, and may even end up producing some kind of a new model about neutron stars, or even discover some kind of a new object we never knew existed before. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss some of the recent updates about the most mysterious object in the solar system as of 2025, the by now famous third interstellar comet 3I Atlas. The comet that was officially discovered on July 1st of 2025, and a comet that astronomers have been racing to study because it's actually going to be almost completely invisible to us for several months very soon. And so in the last few weeks, especially in September of 2025, we actually did have a lot of new studies and a lot of new observations, which means that we kind of have to talk about them again, because this comet is once again changing and is doing something nobody expected. But just so that we're clear, still no aliens, despite the fact that apparently it turned green. And we'll discuss why in a few seconds. And so here, based on the observations from the James Webb and the Very Large Telescope, along with the new observations from the Gemini South Observatory, we now have even better understanding of what's going on here, but some of the initial assumptions about this comet have sort of fundamentally changed, because this is as unusual and as alien as comets can get. And it seems to be unusual both physically and chemically. And so today we're going to focus on some of these new studies, all of which as always you can find in the description below, and mostly focus on why this comet is just so different from anything in the solar system, and what sort of explanations we currently have for all of this, and what do we know so far. And so let's start with the coma and the activity itself, because that's really where most of the mysteries come from. And so here, just as a reminder, we know this contains a solid icy core, or a nucleus, surrounded by the fuzzy atmosphere known as coma. This is essentially what you see right there. And this is why it's sort of difficult to see the surface, because it's covering everything. And in all comets in the solar system, the coma itself usually forms when the object gets relatively close to the orbit of Jupiter, or approximately 5 to 6 astronomical units away from the Sun. And in general, this involves the process known as sublimation, or essentially the solid particles on the surface, instead of melting, just become gas. But the major mystery about 3I Atlas was its unusual activity that was really unexpected, because it actually became active much farther away, with the observations from the Gemini South in August of 2025 confirming that it's still growing and still emitting more and more stuff, which implied that it seems to possess the chemical makeup and the composition that we most likely have never seen before, because we don't expect things to sublimate so early for any of the comets we have here. And so by August of 2025, Gemini South Telescope captured a visible and very prominent anti-solar tail, or tail pointing away from the Sun, that was at least 56,000 kilometers in length, definitely confirming that this seems to have classical cometary behavior. But interestingly, during the early August, they also noticed that some of the inner coma appeared to be slightly elongated and pointing toward the Sun, so it basically had a kind of an anti-tail. But it was pretty quickly determined to be not a tail at all, and instead a dust plume being emitted preferentially from the sunlit side, where the dramatic heating of ice made it sublimate much more actively, essentially releasing a huge amount of dust toward the direction of the sun instead of away from the sun. And by early September, observations confirmed that the inner coma has now evolved into a fan shape, implying that even compared to comets right here in the solar system, this one here was evolving super quickly. And this constant change and these constant emissions gave scientists enough data to start making assumptions about its composition and the core itself. And while almost right away, based on the detections from the James Webb, it was determined to be a strange comet in terms of actual elements. First of all, it was incredibly enriched in carbon dioxide. Here the ratio of carbon dioxide to water was approximately 7.6 to 1. Much higher than anything in the solar system. And because we know carbon dioxide melts at much lower temperatures, this definitively explained why this comet became visible so early on. It essentially started to become cometary at much farther distances because it was mostly carbon dioxide, or at least its surface was mostly carbon dioxide based, with only a little bit of water. And this potentially implies that 3I Atlas may have been formed outside its parent star, or perhaps near what's known as the carbon dioxide ice line. It's essentially a line much farther away from the star, where temperatures are usually cold enough for carbon dioxide or dry ice to condensate and to form solid structures, because otherwise there's really no good explanation for why there's so much CO2 on the surface. And here it was also confirmed that the nucleus has a very thick insulating crust, very likely suppressing sublimation of water, and very likely causing water to remain trapped inside, which basically implies that it has somewhat bizarre surface structure. But at the same time, the Very Large Telescope in Chile was able to confirm two very specific elements that we usually do find around comets. It detected the cyanogen ions, or ions of cyanide, an atomic vapor of nickel. Now, as I mentioned in one of the previous videos, detecting nickel in this case is very common. As a matter of fact, a lot of comets out there usually emit nickel, so that by itself does not mean that this is a metallic object. But what is super strange is that we normally also expect the emissions of iron. And so even though in the solar system, in a natural comet, we do see both iron and nickel, here the lack of iron vapor is actually kind of bizarre, suggesting once again that it seems to have a different formation history from a typical comet in the solar system. With additional observations also revealing that this comet seems to lack a lot of carbon chain compounds, specifically compounds like C2 or dicarbon. And that's actually kind of important for what we're going to be discussing next, which is its change of color. And so because this was depleted in carbon chain compounds, which we do expect to see around comets, here this suggests that compared to comets in the solar system, 3I Atlas was extremely depleted in dicarbon compared to cyanogen atoms. Once again, not something we observe in the solar system, making this super bizarre, at least in terms of chemistry. But now, just a few days ago from when I'm making this video, a team of astrophotographers, Michael Jaeger and Gerald Remen, were able to capture the comet during a lunar eclipse over the skies of Namibia, with this incredible and very beautiful picture showing us something that currently does not make a lot of sense. As you can see, the comet seems to be green. Okay, so that's not unusual for comets, but usually this bright emerald green color is actually caused by dicarbons in a typical solar system comet. So basically, if we see green comets, it's because of the dicarbon atoms being ionized by the solar radiation and emitting green light. Yet, as I just mentioned, the chemical observations from just a few weeks ago discovered no bicarbon, establishing that this is a bicarbon-poor comet and thus should not be able to produce these colors. And so at least as of today, spectroscopic observations suggest that there is no dicarbon at all. Although here I have to mention something really important that's been circulating on the web and unfortunately has been kind of misrepresented by Avi Loeb, that Harvard guy. In one of his recent blog posts on Medium, he essentially tries to explain this color as the emission of cyanide that was confirmed around the comet. And the thing is, well, that's actually kind of incorrect. As a matter of fact, I believe it's very incorrect. I'm actually going to post a link for this older paper from 1994 that specifically talks about this, but for some reason some articles and some websites, and of course Avi Loeb's post, seem to claim that cyanogen emits green light. However, cyanogen emits mostly violet light at 387 nanometers. As a matter of fact, it's almost ultraviolet emissions. And though it does have some weak emissions at 420 nanometers, and the infrared as well, it does not produce any green light at all. And so at the moment it's actually unclear how all of this started and why so much press picked up on this, but for typical comets, cyanogen does not contribute to the green color, as you can learn from the study in the description. As a matter of fact, this study is called the cometary fluorescence spectrum of cyanogen. So like literally the entire study is about the colors. And so the reality right now is that nobody knows why exactly it's green, but that's of course part of the exciting mystery. Because this is such an unusual object and because it's from a completely different star system, we do expect it to emit some really strange things. With the other mystery coming from a slightly different observation in regards to its polarization. With the idea of polarization referring to the light waves wiggling in all directions instead of wiggling in a single direction. And so here, based on the Nordic Optical Telescope, the additional observations from the comet revealed that it's characterized by an extremely deep and narrow negative polarization branch, which is very strange for comets and asteroids, and even previous comets like 2I Borisov or Comet Oumuamua. And so these negative polarization effects suggest that the dust coma is made from a unique mixture of icy and dark materials, with some of the lab experiments showing that a thin frost layer of water ice covering dark surfaces could maybe produce polarization measurements similar to 3I Atlas. Although something somewhat similar has been observed from very far away objects such as trans-Neptunian objects, like for example objects like Pluto and its moon Charon. And intriguingly, in one of the recent studies about the first interstellar object, Oumuamua, a team of scientists provided enough evidence to suggest that Oumuamua might have been some kind of a Plutoid chunk or a fragment of a Pluto-like object from a different star system because of its very strange characteristics and because of its pure nitrogen ice composition and even its pancake shape. And so it would not be strange that we actually have something very similar here as well, with this object also coming from some kind of a faraway region in a different star system, and possibly also being a chunk of a dwarf planet, or some other chunk of ancient ice from an object far away from the star. But one question we still have no answer for is, of course, so where exactly did this come from and how old is this? And that's because currently it's impossible to trace where the comet came from, but one of the recent studies that was just published in September used the data from the famous Gaia telescope to try to reconstruct its trajectory and essentially discovered that in the last 4 million years it did not approach any major stars and seems to have traveled completely undisturbed for a very long time. Now beyond 4 million years we don't really know because the trajectories become very uncertain, but this once again confirms that this is very likely a pristine object. But because it's moving so fast and because of its relatively unusual trajectory, it's still assumed to be a really old object, possibly billions of years older than the solar system, but even that is no longer certain. As a matter of fact, at least one recent study does suggest that this is maybe a little bit younger at 3 billion years, and not 7 as proposed before. And so in terms of the origin and the age, this is not a question we're going to be answering anytime soon. But apart from the green color discovery, there was also something else that we do see in other comets, but in this case something once again a little bit more extreme. The observations from August and September revealed an unusual shift in the comet's color profile. Initially it appeared to be red, which indicates light reflected from the reddish surface, very likely oxidized for billions of years by cosmic ray exposure. But around mid-August of 2025, the color quickly changed and transitioned to something we usually see in the solar system comets. And right now scientists think this is because of a shift from the red particles from the crust that started to be overwhelmed by white grains of ice coming from the surface. So basically here we had separate emissions at different times, and mostly because the comet started to warm up with more and more stuff coming from the surface. Okay, we've discussed the composition, the observation of colors and so on, but what's next? Well, there's actually something exciting that's going to be happening in the next few days that a lot of scientists are trying to capture. According to the projections in late September, this comet is on course to be struck by an extremely powerful coronal mass ejection, or basically a kind of a solar burp that on Earth usually produces the aurora. And this high-energy event is expected to provide scientists with very unique insights into what happens to interstellar ices and dust when these bursts of solar wind and radiation start to interact with it. And so they actually want to see what happens to the tail and the coma, and how this affects the color change as well. As a matter of fact, because of these interactions, we might actually see some of the stuff that was not seen previously, because it's now going to be reacting with all of this solar radiation. And so chances are in the next few weeks we're going to hear more about this comet, until it finally disappears behind the sun in October of 2025. But we might also hear back from the Martian missions, because around early October they should be able to see this comet as well, and might actually collect more data. That's once again because around this time the comet is going to be very close to Mars. And so until November and possibly early December, we're not going to hear much about this, just because it's going to be behind the sun. But once the comet becomes visible again, this is going to be super exciting, because we'll get to see how it changed, and we'll get to see what's actually hiding behind all of this bizarre ice on the surface. And we'll also get to see some of the thicker layers underneath the crust, assuming of course the comet survives the passage and does not fall apart. And so this is definitely one of the most exciting events in 2025, and a very exciting object to study, just because we've never seen anything like it in the solar system. Not only is this different from the solar system comets, it's also different from the 2 previous extrasolar comets that did not show any of these emissions. And so as astronomers continue to watch this, and as they continuously gather more information, we'll just wait and see what happens, and we'll definitely come back and discuss this more in one of the future videos very soon. And so until future observations, that's all I wanted to mention. Thank you for watching, check out previous videos in the description below, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads, and can DM me directly, or by joining channel membership that grants you early access. Alternatively, you can also buy the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.